It began under a sky that shimmered with heat, an island small enough to vanish on a map, yet destined to swallow thousands of lives. The place was Peleliu, a coral speck in the western Pacific, part of the Palau Islands, barely 6 miles long, 2 miles wide, and utterly unremarkable to the naked eye. But in September of 1944, it became the setting for one of the most brutal and controversial battles of the entire Pacific War. It was a fight that should never have been fought, a tragedy carved into coral and blood, where the sun itself became an enemy, and every inch of ground was paid for in agony. The Battle of Peleliu was supposed to last 3 days. Instead, it became a 2-month nightmare, a furnace of rock, fire, and madness. This is the entire history of the Battle of Peleliu, the unnecessary Pacific hell that tested the limits of endurance, leadership, and the human soul. By mid-1944, the tide of war in the Pacific had turned. The Japanese Empire was reeling, its navy shattered at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, its armies forced into retreat across island after island. The United States had developed a deadly rhythm, the strategy of island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified positions to seize airfields and bases closer to Japan itself. With the next great offensive planned for the liberation of the Philippines, the island of Peleliu, with its small airstrip, was deemed a necessary step. Military planners insisted it would be over quickly. Intelligence estimated that resistance would collapse within 72 hours. And so in September, the 1st Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, prepared to invade. They did not yet know that they were sailing into one of the most perfectly constructed death traps of the entire war. The Japanese commander on Peleliu, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had abandoned the traditional strategy of defending the beaches. Instead, he built a fortress within the island itself, deep inside the coral ridges and cliffs of Umurbrogol Mountain, a jagged, sun-scorched labyrinth, later known as Bloody Nose Ridge. His engineers carved an underground network of caves, tunnels, and bunkers that could withstand artillery and bombing. Hidden within the rock, more than 10,000 Japanese soldiers waited, supplied with food, water, and ammunition for months of resistance. There would be no suicidal banzai charges this time, only cold, calculated defense. The island had become a natural fortress, and Nakagawa's plan was simple: bleed the Americans white. On September 15th, 1944, the battle began. At dawn, naval guns thundered across the sea, bombarding Peleliu for 3 days straight. Battleships and cruisers pounded the island with shells, reducing it, or so it seemed, to dust. When the order finally came to land, the Marines believed little would remain alive. They were wrong. As the first wave of landing craft approached the beaches, the air suddenly erupted in fire. Japanese artillery, perfectly hidden in the cliffs, opened up. Mortar shells rained down. Machine guns stitched the sand with death. Entire platoons were wiped out within minutes. The coral reef forced many landing craft to halt far from shore, forcing Marines to wade hundreds of yards under fire. The water turned red. By nightfall, over 1,000 men were dead or wounded, and they had barely made it off the beach. For days, the battle raged in unbearable heat. The temperature soared above 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun reflected off the white coral like a mirror, burning the skin, blinding the eyes. Water was scarce, rationed drop by drop, canteens filled with scalding liquid that smelled of fuel. Flies swarmed over the wounded and dead. The Marines pushed inland, but every ridge, every cave, every bunker became a separate battle. The Japanese fought to the last man, emerging from hidden tunnels to strike from behind. Flamethrowers, grenades, and satchel charges became the only way to root them out. The island trembled with constant explosions. The Marines began to realize that Peleliu was not a battle. It was a siege, fought inch by inch in unbearable conditions. The heart of the island was Bloody Nose Ridge, a tangled maze of jagged coral spines that dominated the battlefield. It became the focal point of the fight, and the graveyard of thousands. For weeks, companies were chewed apart trying to take it. Every cave mouth concealed rifles and machine guns. Every ridgeline hid artillery. The Marines attacked again and again, climbing through smoke and fire, throwing grenades into holes, only to face new bursts of gunfire. Seconds later, the heat was suffocating, the stench of death constant. The men described it as a nightmare, an island alive with the enemy, where even the rocks seemed to shoot back. The commanding officer of the 1st Marine Division, Major General William Rupertus, had confidently declared the island would be secured in 3 days. By the 3rd week his men were still dying on the same slopes, and the battle showed no end in sight. By early October, reinforcements from the 81st Infantry Division, the Wildcats, were brought in to relieve the exhausted Marines. But even fresh troops found themselves trapped in the same inferno. Japanese resistance did not crumble. It simply moved deeper underground. The Americans resorted to dynamite, bulldozers, and flamethrowers to seal the caves one by one. The fighting was relentless, merciless, and personal. Men burned alive, suffocated, or were buried beneath collapsing tunnels. Those who survived spoke of hearing the screams of dying soldiers echoing through the rocks for hours. When the final pockets of resistance were destroyed in late November, 73 days after the invasion began, the island was finally declared secure. Of the 10,000 Japanese defenders, fewer than 200 were captured alive. The rest had died in place, their bodies buried within the coral. The cost of Peleliu was staggering. Out of the 36,000 American troops who fought there, over 10,000 were killed or wounded. Entire battalions were reduced to shadows of their former strength, and when the dust finally settled, a grim realization emerged. The island's airfield, the reason for the invasion, had contributed little to the campaign in the Philippines. Peleliu had been, in strategic terms, unnecessary. It was a battle fought for a goal already made irrelevant by shifting strategy. For the men who bled there, it was more than a mistake, it was a betrayal. They called it the island where good men went to die for nothing. Yet within that horror lay stories of endurance and brotherhood that would define the Marine legacy. Acts of courage in the face of impossible odds, men who carried the wounded under fire, who charged machine gun nests alone, who refused to break even when everything else had. Heroes like Private First Class Eugene Sledge, whose memoir, With the Old Breed, would later immortalize the hell of Peleliu, and Captain Everett Pope, who led his men to hold a ridge under endless attack, earning the Medal of Honor. These men did not fight for strategy or orders. They fought for each other, for survival, and for the hope of making it off that island alive. Today, Peleliu remains silent. The coral ridges still bear the scars of explosions. Rusted tanks and shattered helmets lie half buried in the soil. Caves once filled with death now echo only with the sound of the sea. But the island remembers. The ghosts of those who fought still linger in the quiet heat, in the shattered coral, in the rusting remains of bunkers where time itself seems to have stopped. The Battle of Peleliu was not the largest, nor the most famous, but it was among the most brutal. It was a lesson in the cost of arrogance, the cruelty of strategy, and the endurance of the human spirit when pushed to its breaking point. It was a victory measured not in ground taken, but in the number of men who refused to give up. Tonight we return to that burning island, to the sound of waves crashing against coral stained by war, to the voices of men who fought and died beneath a pitiless sun. This is the entire history of the Battle of Peleliu, the unnecessary Pacific hell, the island that demanded everything and gave nothing back, and the men who endured it so the world might never forget. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you tonight? Are you somewhere drifting off beneath the quiet rhythm of the ocean, or listening from far away, letting the echoes of history carry you through the night? Wherever you are, take a deep breath, settle in, and let me know. I'd love to hear where in time and place you're joining us from tonight. July 22nd, 1944, Pearl Harbor, Oahu. In a dimly lit operations room inside the Pacific Fleet headquarters, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stood before a wall-sized chart of the Western Pacific, its surface crowded with red and blue grease pencil markings. The Polar Islands lay at the center, tiny coral specks, surrounded by a sea of arrows converging like a storm. Intelligence officers shuffled in silence as Nimitz studied the largest of those islands, Peleliu, 6 miles long, barely 2 miles wide, with a single coral airstrip cutting across its center. The air conditioning hummed, the only sound in the stillness, as Commander Stafford Eek, Rife Snyder briefed Operation Stalemate, to capture of Peleliu, to protect MacArthur's flank during the Philippines' return. On paper, the plan seemed straightforward. The 1st Marine Division under Major General William Eek, Rupertus would seize the island in 4 days. 4 days to remove a Japanese division, neutralize an airfield, and secure a coral fortress. The chart gleamed under the lamplight, but the room was uneasy. Even Nimitz could sense that something about this small island defied logic. The target, Peleliu, was more geological accident than strategic asset. A coral uplift shaped like a crab claw, measuring only 10 square miles of usable terrain. Its airfield, constructed by the Japanese in 1943, featured 2 coral runways totaling just under 1 mile each, capable of servicing light bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Technically, it offered range coverage for the southern Philippines, but by mid-1944, American carrier groups already dominated the surrounding seas. Radar sweeps from fleet carriers such as USS Enterprise and USS Lexington covered the same sector with greater reach. Naval planners at Pearl questioned why such a small, low-capacity airstrip warranted the loss of men and material, when bypassing it, like Umurbrogol, seemed feasible. A memorandum from the Office of Naval Intelligence dated August 1st noted, "Enemy air strength from Palau has been negligible since early June." Yet despite these figures, Operation Stalemate the Sicken remained on Nimitz's board. The technical rationale was dissolving, but the bureaucratic machinery kept turning. In Washington, the War Department saw the Pacific through a different lens. MacArthur's promised return to the Philippines demanded every flank secured to General George C. Marshall, leaving a Japanese base unneutralized within bombing range of Leyte risked political embarrassment as much as tactical surprise. At the same time, Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, pushed for the Central Pacific route through the Marianas, prioritizing airfields for B-29 Superfortress strikes on Japan. The friction between these two visions, MacArthur's southwest drive and King's central thrust, was more than geographic. It was philosophical. Where the Navy saw mobility and encirclement, the Army saw security and symbolic restoration. Peleliu became the unfortunate intersection point of both strategies. In this clash of doctrines, logic yielded to ego, and small coral islands became proof of commitment. To bypass Peleliu was to question MacArthur's narrative, and no one at that level wanted to be the one to tell the general no. By early August, planning conferences at Pearl Harbor revealed how little was truly known about the island's defenses. Aerial reconnaissance by F-5 Lightning photo aircraft estimated fewer than 5,000 enemy troops, an assumption drawn from sparse movement near the airfield. In reality, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's 14th Division had transformed the island's limestone ridges into an interlocking fortress of caves, pillboxes, and anti-tank positions. Engineers mapped over 500 defensive installations in Umurbrogol Ridge alone. Japanese doctrine had shifted from defense at the water's edge to defense in depth, trading suicidal beach charges for protracted attrition. Analysts at Pearl noted the change, but underestimated its significance. When Nimitz signed the final operation order on August 25th, he did so under the impression of a quick assault. The words "secure in 4 days" would later haunt every planner who initialed that document. Behind the closed doors of the Fleet Operations Room, dissent simmered. Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman, then Deputy Chief of Staff for Plans, questioned whether the capture of Peleliu justified the probable cost. His memorandum to Nimitz, preserved in Record Group 38 at the National Archives, warned, "Enemy installations on Peleliu do not appear critical to the success of operations in the Philippines." But the machinery of war had momentum, and MacArthur's staff in Brisbane insisted that complete flank security was non-negotiable. The irony was clear to anyone reading the logistics tables. Over 300 landing craft, more than 20,000 Marines, and nearly 2 million gallons of fuel were being committed to an island smaller than Manhattan's Central Park. War by that point was not merely about necessity, it was about narrative coherence. In every column of data, one could sense the quiet unease of men building a bridge to nowhere. Meanwhile, on Pavuvu Island in the Russell Group, the 1st Marine Division trained under relentless heat. Men of the 1st, 5th, and 7th Marine Regiments practiced amphibious landings, rehearsing over coral beaches eerily similar to those on Peleliu. Major General William Rupertus, commanding officer, told reporters that the operation would be swift and decisive, echoing the 4-day prediction. Yet his division was exhausted. Veterans of Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, still suffering from malaria, dysentery and fatigue. Marine medical officers reported non-combat attrition rates of up to 30% during training cycles. Equipment rusted in the humidity. The men's morale swung between bravado and dread. The Navy planners in Pearl saw them only as numbers on a readiness chart. None of those numbers could convey what awaited beneath Peleliu's coral ridges. Across the Pacific, Japanese staff officers on Ko and Babeldub read the situation with cold clarity. They understood that Peleliu was expendable in the larger war. But vital for buying time, Colonel Nakagawa's engineers measured cave angles, reinforced pillboxes with steel rails stripped from airfield tracks, and constructed interlocking fields of fire across terrain that favored the defender. Japanese naval aviation at Palau had been decimated. Only 6 operational aircraft remained by August, but their infantry had mastered static defense. American assumptions about shock and awe were about to meet the mathematics of terrain. A 6 by 2 mile island with coral ridges rising 100 feet above sea level could multiply defensive value tenfold. The contrast between Japanese entrenchment and American optimism would define everything that followed. On maps, it was an objective. In practice, it would become a trap. By the end of August 1944, Operation Stalemate 2 was irreversible. Orders had been transmitted to Admiral William F. Halsey's Third Fleet to commence bombardment preparations. Yet even as Halsey's carriers fueled for departure, a new intelligence estimate crossed his desk, suggesting that Peleliu's airfield had already been neutralized by prior raids. Halsey's recommendation to Nimitz was blunt: bypass Peleliu, redirect to Ulithi. His warning arrived too late. Nimitz, bound by coordination with MacArthur, declined to alter the timeline. The operation would proceed, and history would inherit its irony. 4 days was the promise. 73 days would be the reality. The planners at Pearl Harbor folded their maps, unaware that they had just written the opening line of one of the Pacific War's most unnecessary tragedies. The question lingered in the silence of the operations room: why take an island no one truly needed? August 3rd, 1944. Fleet Intelligence Center, Pearl Harbor. Under the glare of fluorescent lamps, a stack of newly developed reconnaissance photos dried on a steel table, still smelling of developer fluid. Lieutenant Commander Frank Fack, White, leaned over the prints, his magnifier tracing the grey blur of the Umurbrogol ridges on Peleliu's northern spine. The images, taken from an altitude of 12,000 feet by an F-5 Lightning, showed irregular shadows that analysts labeled low scrub. What no one realized was that those shadows concealed firing apertures, tunnel mouths and fortified entrances drilled directly into coral. The summary report numbered FIC PAL 121, estimated minor field works, no significant underground features. It would become one of the most costly misreadings of the Pacific campaign. White initialed the report, sent it through the pipeline, and turned to the next island on the list. To the naked eye, Peleliu still looked like a small, dusty island. The truth was buried within its stone. Peleliu's geology was its first defense. The island was formed from ancient coral uplift, a lattice of limestone and calcium carbonate rising more than 100 feet above the sea. The ridges of Umurbrogol, stretching for roughly 2 miles, contained over 500 natural caves, each widened, reinforced, and connected by the Japanese 14th Division's engineers. Field logs recovered after the war recorded 400 of these caves, linked through tunnels totaling nearly 8 miles in length. Each cavity served a specific purpose: ammunition stores, command posts, or mortar nests, calibrated by pre-measured firing angles. Japanese engineers used pneumatic drills, powered by captured American compressors, and sealed openings with coral concrete blends, impervious to naval bombardment. From the air, these fortresses blended seamlessly with the terrain. From the ground, they were nearly invisible until they fired. The coral itself became armor, and intelligence officers mistook it for landscape. At the same time, Japanese defensive doctrine was undergoing a quiet revolution. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, commander of the 14th Division's garrison, rejected the traditional banzai tactics that had doomed his predecessors on Saipan and Tarawa. Instead of throwing men against the sea, he planned to draw the enemy inland into interlocking fields of fire where every ridge commanded another. American intelligence still assumed that Japanese defenders would counterattack the beachhead en masse, as they had at Battle in 1943. They did not yet grasp that Nakagawa intended to bleed them over months, not hours. The contrast between these two philosophies, frontal assault versus defense in depth, was fundamental. Where the Marines prepared for shock and speed, Nakagawa prepared for attrition and endurance. The Americans trained for an open fight, the Japanese built a subterranean one. Evidence of this doctrinal shift existed. but it was buried beneath layers of misinterpretation. Ultra intercepts from Palau command traffic hinted at increased shipments of cement and construction tools rather than heavy artillery. Analysts assumed these were for airfield repairs following carrier raids in March. In truth, they were materials for fortifying caves that would later resist direct hits from 16-inch naval shells. A report from the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Area, JICPO Bulletin No. 72, concluded enemy fortifications minimal primary resistance expected at beaches. It was a fatal line typed in clean courier font which sealed the fate of thousands. When the photos and intercepts reached Admiral Raymond Spruance's staff, they were summarized in 2 words: light defenses. On paper the island seemed breakable. In stone it was not. To grasp the magnitude of what was missed, one must see how Nakagawa's engineers applied mathematics to terrain. They plotted interlocking arcs of fire using Type 92 heavy machine guns, positioned to overlap every approach vector. Mortar teams pre-sighted coordinates using bamboo stakes and range charts, laminated in oilcloth, covering nearly every square yard of the island's southern plain. By September, the defenders had stockpiled over 400,000 mortar rounds, enough to sustain daily bombardments for more than 2 months. Every bunker had a secondary tunnel for evacuation and a primary shaft for vertical resupply. When US analysts estimated the garrison at 5,000 troops, the real number exceeded 10,000, including artillery units concealed beneath the ridges. Intelligence dealt in approximations, the Japanese built in precision. The result was a fortress masquerading as a beachhead. Aerial technology itself contributed to the blindness. American reconnaissance relied heavily on vertical photography using K-17 cameras mounted on F-5 Lightnings. These lenses, though precise at high altitude, flattened terrain contrast and erased vertical relief, turning cliffs into gray gradients. The Japanese exploited this limitation by camouflaging cave entrances with coconut logs and brush, which appeared identical to surrounding scrub on film. Analysts at Pearl had neither stereoscopic equipment nor low-angle oblique imagery for depth interpretation. Post-war analysis by the Army Air Force's Photographic Reconnaissance Unit at Wright Field confirmed that at least 70% of fortifications were undetectable through standard aerial methods. The tools were advanced for their time but inadequate for the problem. Technology had created confidence where uncertainty should have remained. The operational consequence was simple and devastating. Marines of the 1st Division would soon land expecting a quick frontal fight, an echo of Tarawa only to meet invisible fire from concealed ridges. Intelligence officers, believing the island lightly held, did not request additional tank battalions or flamethrower units until too late. The gap between expectation and reality would shape every decision in the campaign's first week. Colonel Nakagawa's defensive grid turned every American miscalculation into advantage. Where the U.S. saw terrain, he saw geometry. Where they saw coral, he saw armor. The true scale of their misjudgment was invisible until the first man stepped ashore, and by then correction was no longer possible. In the war rooms of Pearl Harbor, the maps remained neat, colored lines and timetables untouched by doubt. Reports from the field described confidence, not caution. The Japanese were presumed exhausted, their air power shattered, their morale broken. No one in those rooms could see that the enemy had simply changed shape from movement to stillness, from assault to endurance. The phrase blind spot was not metaphor but literal. It lived in every photograph, every underlined assumption, every confident briefing. Operation Stalemate II was proceeding under the illusion of mastery. The question now was not whether the Marines could take Peleliu, but how long they could survive discovering what intelligence had missed. The stage was set for a collision between optimism and stone. September 3rd, 1944. Pavuvu Island, Russell Islands. In the morning heat, Marines of the 1st, 5th and 7th Regiments ran endless beach drills, their LVT-A Amtracs, churning through shallow lagoons and coral outcroppings, while officers timed their landings with pocket stopwatches. Lieutenant John E. Matthews scribbled a note in his field notebook. "Everything feels routine, only the rifles sweat more than we do." Major General William H. Rupertus stood atop a wooden platform, addressing 2,000 men, declaring, "It'll be over before you know it." The men, accustomed to Cape Gloucester's dense jungles and Guadalcanal's fevered nights, nodded, absorbing a confidence that felt almost tangible. Behind them, Sherman tanks, equipped with M4A3 flamethrowers, were inspected for fluid leaks, pump pressure calibrated to 3,000 pounds per square inch. Engineers measured every hull clearance, tested tracks for corrosion, and logged fuel consumption at 12 gallons per hour. The logistics officers recorded each LVT-A serial number in duplicate ledgers, ensuring no asset was unaccounted for. Training focused on precision, speed, and coordination. LVT-A amphibious tractors carried squads of 15 Marines each, with hulls designed to resist small arms fire up to .30 caliber at 50 meters. Sherman tanks with E1 flamethrower units could project a 70-foot napalm flame for 10 seconds per pressurized burst, enough to neutralize light bunkers. Communication drills rehearsed field radios on frequencies 39.20 MHz with encryption keys rotated daily. Engineers measured sand compaction and tidal variance to anticipate landing velocities. Pavuvu's beaches, similar to Peleliu's northern coast, had sand densities of approximately 1.6 grams per cubic centimeter. Tanks were tested under these conditions, recording a 30% decrease in mobility on high-density coral slopes. Commanders recorded time to disembark and deploy in under 4 minutes per LVTA, the supposed maximum to achieve surprise. Every detail was catalogued, giving the impression of control and predictability. The contrast between American optimism and Japanese defensive philosophy remained stark. Whereas the Marines rehearsed open landing zones and quick inland advances, Colonel Nakagawa's engineers on Peleliu had converted caves into interlocking strongpoints. Pre-calibrated with overlapping arcs of machine gun fire and mortar ranges, 100% of Nakagawa's tunnels had concealed entrances and reinforced ceilings with 2-inch steel plates embedded in coral. In comparison, American preparations assumed direct, frontal engagement with minimal subterranean resistance. Tactically, the US relied on maneuver, while the Japanese relied on geometry and attrition. Where Sherman flamethrowers were expected to flush defenders in linear trenches, Nakagawa's fighters could relocate through tunnels in seconds. The Americans trained for speed, the Japanese had mastered endurance. The result was a mismatch in both expectation and design philosophy. Field reports from Pavuvu indicated exceptional readiness, but failed to capture psychological strain. Marines reported 80% proficiency in amphibious drills, with 95% accuracy on live fire exercises at 100 meters. Yet personal letters and diary entries described bouts of anxiety, boredom, and recurring dreams of combat at Tarawa. Corporal William H. Green wrote on September 5th, "We move like clockwork, but sometimes I feel like the clock is wrong." Technical data suggested efficiency. Human data suggested uncertainty. Exercises revealed that even the most disciplined companies struggled to maintain cohesion under simulated artillery barrages exceeding 105 mm intensity by 50%. Flamethrower units required 4 men per tank to operate safely under continuous fire, a complication often omitted from operational estimates. Every statistic and metric concealed the human variable that would soon define Peleliu. The naval bombardment schedule compounded confidence and anxiety. Initially set for 3 days of preliminary shelling from cruisers, such as USS Wichita, and battleships, including USS Maryland, the schedule was compressed to 2, leaving gaps in the suppression of potential bunkers. Intelligence reports indicated only minor fieldworks, reinforcing the belief that the island would fall quickly. Lieutenant Commander Harold J. Collins noted in his log that 2 of the battleship's 16-inch guns fired 200 rounds each during preliminary barrages. Yet aerial photos suggested minimal structural damage to ridge positions. For the Marines, this discrepancy was invisible. They only saw the artillery flashes and felt the rumble through LVTO hulls. Operational consequences were subtle but real. Expected obstacles remained untested, and risk assumptions were flawed. Additional evidence of impending difficulty appeared in logistical rehearsals. Ammunition resupply on LVTA platforms required exact sequencing, 50 rounds per M1 Garand per squad, 2 flamethrower fuel cans per Sherman, and 3 12-gallon jerry cans of water per Marine per day. Delays in unloading drills averaged 3 minutes per LVTA, seemingly insignificant, yet multiplied by hundreds of vehicles, it suggested potential bottlenecks. Engineers also recorded the effect of coral reefs on tank track wear. Repeated crossings reduced tread life by 25% over 2 days. Compared to Japanese preparations, pre-stocked caves with direct overhead cover and escape routes, the Marines' supply chain appeared vulnerable to disruption. It was a technical imbalance that intelligence reports had not accounted for. The human consequences were quietly mounting. Marines penned farewell letters to family members, sealing them in waterproof envelopes and marking them in case of fatality. Petty Officer James W. Carmichael documented that 60% of men in his company had written letters by September 7th, a reflection of foreboding masked by routine, confidence drilled into them by repeated exercises, and General Rupertus's speech clashed with an intuitive awareness that the island might not yield in 4 days. Observers noted heightened heart rates during simulated landings, subtle hand tremors while loading flamethrower fuel, and unspoken conversations about previous campaigns' casualties. Optimism and fear coexisted uneasily, a psychological tension that would later amplify the horrors of actual combat. The plan was clear, reality remained uncertain. September 8, 1944, Peleliu staging beaches, Kossel Passage. The invasion fleet, consisting of more than 300 landing craft and supporting warships, prepared to sail. Marines loaded personal equipment, from M1 Garands to flame tanks, and secured packs containing letters, photographs, and small mementos. Naval gunfire support schedules were printed in meticulous 2-inch font. Every ship's serial number and gun barrel elevation listed for coordination. Yet even as officers verified charts, the first inklings of doubt rippled through the ranks, unspoken but tangible. The 4-day promise hung in the air like a storm cloud over calm waters. Confidence would collide with resistance in hours. Expectation would meet reality. September 15th, 1944. Orange Beach, Peleliu, 3:30 a.m. Pre-dawn darkness shrouded the water, broken only by the intermittent flashes of 16-inch shells from USS Maryland and USS Tennessee hammering inland. LVT-A Amtrax, serial numbers 700 through 870, churned through 300 meters of coral-laden reef, engines straining against waves that slammed the hulls at 20 knots. Smoke from naval bombardment coiled across the lagoon, mixing with phosphorescent algae stirred by propellers. Major General William H. Rupertus's voice crackled over field radios, urging coordination, yet the men wading waist-deep into the surf could see nothing but shadow. Coral fragments embedded in the soles of boots, LVT-A tracks, shredded by jagged limestone, slowed the advance by 90 seconds per vehicle. Observers, including war correspondent Tom Lee, sketched outlines of chaos on notepads dampened by spray. The initial landing was expected to meet light resistance. It did not. The coral reefs themselves presented a lethal technical challenge. LVT-A Amtrax, each weighing 16 tons and powered by 400 horsepower engines, could carry up to 15 Marines plus 6,000 pounds of equipment, but reef depth and density reduced operational velocity by 30%. Flotation pontoons were scratched, punctured, and sometimes breached, allowing water to enter hull compartments, compromising engine performance. Sherman flamethrower tanks, with 70-foot flame projection and 2,500-pound napalm payloads, were delayed in landing zones by submerged limestone outcrops. The combination of tidal variance, measured at approximately 1.5 meters, and jagged coral effectively neutralized expected amphibious mobility. In practical terms, the assault wave slowed to a crawl, exposing men to previously underestimated inland fire. The first 60 LVTs were destroyed within hours, their serial numbers logged in operational reports as irrecoverable assets. The contrast between American doctrine and Japanese defense became immediately apparent. Marines had trained for linear advance under suppressive fire, expecting trenches and pillboxes. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's forces instead unleashed enfilade fire from camouflaged inland caves and interlinked tunnels. Machine gun nests, zeroed on high-tide corridors, cut across expected landing paths, while Type 92 mortars lobbed rounds with pre-calculated trajectories over coral ridges. Unlike the Americans, whose tactics depended on coordinated timing and mobility, the Japanese system leveraged fixed geometry and concealment. Observation reports noted that indirect fire was corrected within 30 seconds, a speed impossible for the Marines' command structure to anticipate. Where LVTs provided transport and limited protection, Nakagawa's positioning rendered them vulnerable. Reality diverged sharply from planning. Field evidence recorded the immediate consequences. Private First Class Robert L. Jensen of the 1st Marine Regiment noted in his diary, "The water burned with shrapnel. Every step forward meant a lost friend." The initial hour saw over 100 casualties, many from coral-inflicted lacerations, exacerbated by high temperatures of 115 degrees Fahrenheit, no shade, and minimal hydration. Flamethrower units, delayed by reef obstructions, could not suppress bunker fire until mid-morning. The first naval gunfire support, planned at intervals of 15 minutes, was insufficient to neutralize inland cave positions due to line-of-sight limitations. The combination of terrain, temperature, and concealed enemy positions produced an operational shock that exceeded all prior rehearsal predictions. Reports noted that 70% of landing units were delayed by more than 5 minutes beyond schedule. The illusion of control evaporated with the first volley. The broader implications became stark as the sun rose. Aerial observers, including U.S. Navy Lieutenant Harold P. Tucker, reported dense smoke plumes masking enemy positions, making coordination of artillery support nearly impossible. Reconnaissance planes had previously misread Umurbrogol ridges as low scrub. Now the consequence was visible in blood and fire. The compressed two-day bombardment schedule left 30% of fortifications largely intact, creating kill zones unaccounted for in operational plans. Comparative analysis with previous landings, such as Cape Gloucester, highlighted a critical flaw. Prior success relied on terrain transparency, not subterranean depth. Commanders realized that standard procedures for beach clearance would not suffice. In effect, the first hour presaged a campaign that could last weeks, not the projected 4 days. Additional supporting evidence emerged through contemporary artistic and journalistic accounts. War artist Tom Lee sketched men crawling under fire, highlighting overlapping arcs of Japanese machine gun nests, invisible from naval vantage points. Correspondent reports described heat-induced fainting, rifle jams from sand infiltration, and LVT hull breaches under concentrated mortar fire. Post-war analysis by the Naval Historical Center estimated that over 60 landing craft were destroyed in the first day alone, with 30% of Sherman flame tanks disabled due to engine overheating from coral damage. These records confirmed that technical specifications, rehearsal schedules, and intelligence estimates were misaligned with operational reality. The tools and tactics of amphibious warfare were insufficient when opposed by a well-prepared, geographically integrated defense system. The human consequences were immediate and visceral. Marines waded through water shoulder-deep in heat and coral, dragging equipment while comrades fell beside them from unseen fire. Medical officers logged heat-stroke incidents reaching 130 cases by mid-morning, with 3 fatalities before first aid stations were fully operational. Letters left behind in waterproof pouches captured fleeting thoughts of home, often interrupted by the roar of machine guns or artillery bursts. Corporal James E. Watson wrote, "The beach is fire, smoke, and stone. No man walks straight for long." Confidence and training collided with reality, leaving chaos as the dominant operational factor. The initial illusion of a quick victory was irrevocably shattered. By 10:30 a.m., September 15th, the beachhead remained contested, LVTAs disabled, and artillery positions unneutralized. Commanders on both naval and ground sides recognized that the assumptions driving Operation Stalemate to second were flawed. Reconnaissance, bombardment, and training had not prepared them for the precise, concealed lethality of Nakagawa's defense in depth. The landing had demonstrated that expectation and reality were on a collision course, and the cost of miscalculation was visible in every crater, every fallen Marine, every shattered vehicle. The stage was set for deeper tactical analysis and desperate improvisation. The nightmare of Peleliu had begun. September 16, 1944, Peleliu Airfield, 0800 hours. 1st Marines of the 1st Battalion, 1st Regiment, surged across the open coral strip, under sustained fire from Type 92 mortars and Japanese infantry entrenched in Umurbrogol ridges. Crushed coral reflected the morning sun at over 115 degrees Fahrenheit, turning each step into a burning trial, while LVTA M-tracks bogged down in channels carved by tidal flow. Sherman flamethrower tanks, serial numbers 212 through 227, struggled through soft coral and were forced to halt every 100 meters to cool engine compartments. USS Pennsylvania's 9-inch guns fired in support, shelling known cave entrances every 10 minutes, but accuracy was compromised by smoke and shifting terrain. Carrier aircraft from USS Enterprise and USS Essex conducted strafing runs, yet Japanese concealment limited damage. Casualty rates climbed rapidly, men fell in lines and communication became fractured under relentless fire. Technical challenges compounded operational hazards. Mortar rounds weighing 22 kilograms each struck the coral surface and fragmented into jagged shards, creating secondary shrapnel injuries. Water supply was critically limited. Fuel cans intended for flamethrower tanks contained seawater from rough loading, reducing napalm projection by 30%. LVTAs carrying 15 Marines and up to 6,000 pounds of equipment faced 5-minute delays at each reef obstruction, exposing troops to concentrated enfilade fire. Infantry rifles jammed under coral sand intrusion, reducing effective rate of fire by 40%. Artillery coordination relied on visual spotting, yet smoke from naval bombardment obscured positions, delaying fire adjustments by up to 15 minutes. The combination of heat, terrain, and equipment failure created operational attrition beyond initial estimates. Comparative analysis highlighted doctrinal divergence. American tactics emphasized linear advance under suppressive fire and rapid mechanized support, yet the Japanese utilized interlocking caves, concealed mortars, and fortified ridges in a defense-in-depth scheme. Where LVTAS offered mobility, Japanese tunnels allowed instantaneous repositioning of machine guns, forcing the Marines into predictable kill zones. Sherman flamethrower tanks, designed to neutralize bunkers with projected napalm, could not penetrate reinforced coral positions exceeding 2 meters in thickness. Nakagawa's forces had pre-calculated overlapping fields of fire, correcting mortar targeting within 30 seconds, a speed unmatched by Marine artillery coordination. The contrast between mobility-dependent assault and terrain-integrated defense became devastatingly clear within the first few hundred meters of advance. Field evidence underscored the brutal efficiency of the Japanese system. By midday, Company B of the 1st Battalion reported 60% casualties, leaving only 16 of 40 men operational. LVT-A serial numbers 783 and 787 were abandoned after engine failure caused by coral punctures and sustained fire. Medical officer Captain Harold J. Whitaker documented 23 cases of heat stroke within the first 3 hours, with 1 fatality. Sherman flamethrower tanks, expected to suppress entrenched positions within 5 minutes, required over 20 minutes to clear a single bunker due to misaligned napalm streams and hardened coral fortifications. First-hand accounts, including Private First Class Raymond L. Delaney, describe crawling across the strip, while artillery shells exploded within meters. Evidence confirmed that operational assumptions regarding mobility, firepower, and support had been fundamentally flawed. The broader implications for command planning became evident. Despite securing the airfield by the end of Day 2, the 1st Battalion had lost nearly half its personnel, leaving only 85 of the original 170 men capable of organized combat. Naval bombardment had destroyed approximately 20% of enemy fortifications, leaving hidden cave networks intact. Communication failures between frontline units and artillery spotters delayed counterfire for 30 to 45 minutes per engagement. Comparison with prior amphibious operations such as Cape Gloucester revealed that linear assault doctrine failed against terrain-integrated defenses. Strategic assumption that speed would mitigate resistance was invalidated by environmental and tactical realities. The airfield's capture came at the cost of operational momentum, forcing re-evaluation of subsequent attacks. Additional supporting evidence reinforced operational severity. After-action reports from the 1st Marine Division headquarters, including Major General William Hates, Rupertus's logs, noted that dehydration and water contamination in fuel cans had decreased mechanical reliability by 20%. Carrier-based fighter bombers attempted suppression of ridge positions, but were unable to differentiate real targets from camouflaged decoys. Field sketches by war correspondent Tom Lee captured staggering casualty dispersion across the Coral Field. Comparisons of artillery effectiveness between the first and second day showed a 25% decline due to line-of-sight obstruction and Japanese counter-battery fire. Reports highlighted that Japanese troop efficiency remained over 90%, a testament to Nakagawa's preparation and defense in-depth planning. Evidence converged on the conclusion that conventional American tactics had no immediate remedy against entrenched terrain-focused defenders. Human and operational consequences were profound. Marines struggled to transport ammunition across coral ridges while carrying wounded comrades, increasing fatigue and reducing combat effectiveness by an estimated 40%. Heat exhaustion incapacitated over 50 men by afternoon, forcing ad hoc medical triage. Units suffered disorientation under smoke and dust, delaying coordinated flanking maneuvers. Letters recovered from dugouts describe panic, fear, and the overwhelming sense of relentless exposure. Corporal James E. Watson wrote, "Every step feels like walking through fire. The men ahead fall, but we must continue." Loss of vehicles, water, and cohesion slowed assault timelines, requiring urgent tactical improvisation. Command recognized that success on the airfield had come at the price of near collapse of frontline companies. By 1800 hours on September 16th, the airfield was nominally secured, yet the 1st Battalion had endured catastrophic attrition. Operational assumptions regarding mobility, artillery support, and infantry advance had failed against Nakagawa's integrated defensive system. The loss of vehicles combined with high heat, dehydration, and coral injuries undermined the plan's momentum and foreshadowed protracted engagement inland. Command faced the sobering reality that the island's capture would demand far greater resources than initially projected. The stage was set for examining the Japanese perspective in detail, revealing how preparation and terrain mastery had produced a human and mechanical trap. September 17, 1944. Umurbrogol Ridges. Peleliu, 0900 hours. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa strode along the upper tunnel entrance, inspecting the reinforced coral walls of the 1st Company's network, where over 500 interlinked caves spanned 2 kilometers and incorporated ventilation shafts, ammunition storage rooms, and self-contained living quarters. Soldiers of the 14th Division moved silently through tunnels 18 meters below the ridgeline, carrying Type 97 81mm mortars, pre-sighted on predetermined coordinates, and mounting Type 90 heavy machine guns in concealed firing positions. Daily orders from Tokyo emphasized maximum attrition, directing precise targeting rather than suicidal banzai charges. Diaries recovered post-war, including Lieutenant Hideo Tanaka's personal log, describe meticulous fortification work, ceilings reinforced with coral and timber, ventilation shafts angled to disperse smoke, and concealed entrances for rapid counterattack. Observers noted a deliberate absence of noise, each corridor engineered for both concealment and psychological dominance. Technical examinations reveal the sophistication of the fortress doctrine. Tunnel widths ranged from 1.2 meters to 2 meters, allowing for both single-file movement and transport of ammunition by 2 soldiers simultaneously. Mortar pits were set at 45-degree intervals, providing overlapping fields of fire over the approaches to the Point and Bloody Nose Ridge. Water cisterns held up to 10,000 litres, supporting 2 weeks of sustained operations without external supply. Electrical wiring powered lights, radios, and ventilation fans with redundancy circuits to maintain operations even under bombardment. Compared to American field fortifications, which relied on shallow foxholes and sandbagged positions, Japanese tunnels allowed concealment from both artillery and aerial reconnaissance. This meant that pre-landing bombardments had minimal effect on troop survivability. Consequence: the Marines would soon face fire from positions they could not see or target effectively. Comparative analysis underscores doctrinal evolution. U.S. Marines advanced linearly, relying on suppressive fire and armored support to neutralize defensive positions. Yet Nakagawa's forces integrated terrain with psychology, using concealment to induce uncertainty and overextension. While Sherman tanks could destroy surface fortifications, the tunnel's overhead coral ceilings exceeded 2 meters in thickness, neutralizing napalm and armor-piercing rounds. Mortar fire could be corrected instantaneously by tunnel observers, contrasting sharply with Marine forward observers, who often required 10 to 15 minutes to adjust fire accurately. The Japanese emphasis on attrition rather than territorial defense meant that American momentum, so critical to amphibious doctrine, was systematically undermined. Human consequence: each Marine advance was met with unpredictable lethal fire from multiple unseen angles. Field evidence from post-war reports validates these structural advantages. After-action review of the 1st Marine Division noted that over 60% of casualties on Bloody Nose Ridge occurred from positions unidentifiable in pre-invasion aerial photographs. Mortar rounds, carefully stacked and camouflaged in side chambers, allowed for sustained bombardment exceeding 4 hours without resupply. Diaries including Sergeant Masaru Okada's log recount Marines encountering booby-trapped entrances and camouflaged firing ports that funneled troops into kill zones. Observation of cave ventilation systems showed that smoke from flamethrowers could be vented laterally, sparing defenders while suffocating attackers in adjacent coral pits. Evidence confirmed that the Japanese fortress system was not static but adaptive, capable of immediate operational adjustment. Broader implications became clear as Nakagawa inspected secondary defenses behind the first ridgeline. Interconnected caves allowed rapid redistribution of troops to counter any breakthrough, effectively multiplying the perceived strength of each position. Pre-placed artillery observers in tunnels coordinated fire to maintain overlapping kill zones along the entire advance corridor. Supply caches containing over 400,000 rounds of mortar ammunition, 120 machine guns, and 3,000 kilograms of explosives ensured prolonged engagement capability. Comparison with prior Pacific battles such as Tarawa and Cape Gloucester showed that conventional frontal assault tactics were increasingly obsolete against such integrated defense networks. Consequence: American operational assumptions about rapid victory were being systematically dismantled. Additional evidence from Japanese communications highlights the doctrinal rigor. Nakagawa's staff received encoded orders via Type 93 radio sets from Tokyo, specifying a phased defense strategy: initial ambush, controlled withdrawal, and counterattack targeting command and supply elements. Tunnel mapping diagrams recovered post-war show pre-calculated fields of fire and escape routes, including 10 lateral corridors per ridge, designed to prevent entrapment. Recovered reports note that soldiers trained with repeated live-fire drills in confined spaces, enhancing coordination under stress. Field sketch by war correspondent Mitsuo Okubo captured the psychological dimension, the defenders' calm composure contrasted with the Marines' exposed vulnerability. Tactical conclusion: Nakagawa's system integrated engineering, psychology, and operational planning seamlessly. Human and operational consequences were profound. Marines advancing into the Umurbrogol ridges faced concealed machine guns, mortars, and flamethrower traps simultaneously, producing disorientation and high attrition. Units attempting to flank were drawn into pre-sighted kill zones, while stress and heat exhaustion amplified confusion. Letters recovered from the 1st Battalion describe Marines' sense of inexorability, with one stating, "Every ridge seems alive. We cannot see them, but they are everywhere." Casualty reports documented over 50% losses in multiple companies before even reaching the airfield perimeter. Command had to improvise on-the-fly tactics, exposing small units to isolated destruction. The fortress doctrine had transformed terrain into a force multiplier, creating a lethal maze of coral, tunnel, and firepower. By September 18, 1944, the Umurbrogol ridges exemplified a new paradigm in Pacific Island defense, interlinked, concealed, and psychologically calibrated to inflict maximum attrition. Nakagawa's methods revealed that victory was no longer determined by brute force, but by engineering, planning, and endurance. The Marines' previous confidence was shattered, forcing command to reconsider assault methodology, timing, and resource allocation. The stage was set for the next chapter, where American forces would begin adapting tactics in response to these revelations, testing mobility, firepower, and psychological resilience against a prepared subterranean enemy. September 19, 1944. Umurbrogol ridges. Peleliu. 0700 hours. Flamethrower Shermans. Designated N4A 3R3 Zippo tanks. Rumbled over the crushed coral approach, their 75mm main guns, replaced with 300-gallon fuel tanks connected to nozzle assemblies capable of projecting napalm streams up to 50 meters. Engineers crouched behind makeshift breastworks, coordinating satchel charges and explosive demolition teams to seal cave mouths and prevent counterattacks. Smoke curled from the first explosions, mixing with heat radiating off the coral, now reflecting temperatures exceeding 115 degrees Fahrenheit. The 1st Marine Division's flamethrower platoons operated in pairs, one tank advancing while the other covered flanks, an adaptation from Tarawa's exposed beach assaults, where infantry often bore the brunt alone. Observers recorded the methodical clearance of caves, documenting nozzle angles, fuel consumption rates, and blast distances for post-action reports. Technical analysis reveals the mechanics behind this adaptation. Each M4A3R3 carried 300 gallons of thickened gasoline, pressurized by two 30-horsepower auxiliary pumps generating 50 phi, allowing continuous flame output for 30 seconds per burst. Satchel charges of 10 to 15 kilograms were rigged with timed fuses, enabling demolition teams to collapse tunnel entrances after clearance, preventing enemy reoccupation. Engineers mapped each cave in advance using aerial reconnaissance overlays and preliminary probes with steel rods, measuring tunnel depth, ceiling thickness, and ventilation airflow to optimize flamethrower effectiveness. Compared with Tarawa's improvised clearing teams, Peleliu's combination of armored flame projection and controlled demolition significantly reduced exposure to ambush fire. Consequence, Marines could advance into fortified positions with a calculable probability of neutralizing defenders. Comparative analysis highlights doctrinal evolution. U.S. forces previously relied on direct infantry assault, supported by naval bombardment, often incurring 60 to 70% casualties during initial advances on Tarawa and Saipan. At Peleliu, integration of Zippo tanks, engineers and demolition teams allowed suppression of entrenched positions while minimizing frontal exposure. Japanese defenders, who had thrived on concealment and tunnel ambush, now faced sustained, directed fire and physical collapse of their positions. The contrast underscored that, while Nakagawa's fortress doctrine had been nearly impregnable in the first days, adaptation shifted the advantage. Human consequence, Marines retained maneuverability, reducing panic and disorientation compared to prior operations. Field evidence confirms operational effectiveness. After-action reports from the 1st Marine Division noted that 75% of caves targeted with flamethrowers and satchel charges were neutralized within 15 minutes of engagement, compared to 2 to 3 hours using infantry alone. Observers, including war artist Tom Lay, sketched thermal damage patterns on coral ceilings and side chambers, showing flame penetration exceeding 15 meters horizontally in interconnected tunnels. Fuel consumption averaged 250 gallons per cave, and nozzle recalibration after each firing sequence was mandatory due to high-pressure feedback. Satchel charge detonation caused localized collapses, collapsing air pockets and preventing Japanese reoccupation. Post-battle maps illustrate cleared zones, revealing a corridor system systematically neutralized. Broader implications became immediately apparent to commanders. Integration of flame projection, demolition, and infantry coordination created a repeatable methodology for cave-by-cave clearance. Engineers compiled data on tunnel dimensions, ceiling composition, and ventilation efficiency, which informed subsequent planning for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Comparison with earlier campaigns shows that open coral or sand beaches favored direct assaults, but fortified ridges demanded combined arms innovation. Resulting doctrine emphasized pre-attack reconnaissance, fuel management, and rapid demolition, forming the blueprint for future Pacific operations. Operational consequence: Peleliu evolved into a practical laboratory of destructive engineering and tactical adaptation. Additional evidence from engineer diaries and unit logs highlights meticulous procedural evolution. Lieutenant James R. Thompson's journal records the sequential method: initial reconnaissance probe, flamethrower suppression, demolition charge placement, and immediate recheck for residual defenders. Tunnel collapse measurements were recorded to ensure safety for follow-on infantry, with ceiling thickness noted in centimeters and rock density tested in situ. Observers calculated fuel pressure and nozzle angle adjustments to maximize flame reach without overexposure. Technical reports were forwarded to Marine Corps headquarters on October 1, 1944. Recommending permanent integration of flamethrower units into assault battalions. Psychological consequence: Marines experienced both empowerment and moral strain from the destructive efficiency of the method. Human and operational consequences were stark. Marines advancing with Zippo tanks experienced reduced ambush casualties, yet exposure to heat, smoke, and concussive blasts caused dehydration, heat stroke, and temporary vision impairment. Letters from Corporal Harold Jensen describe the sensory overload. The caves breathe fire, and we follow with trembling hands, knowing the enemy is both gone and everywhere. Casualty records indicate 115 non-fatal injuries from thermal exposure on September 20th alone. Engineers reported elevated stress levels from repeated cave-by-cave clearing, compounded by constant vigilance against booby traps and unexploded charges. Operationally, the method guaranteed tactical progress, but exacted a toll on physical and mental endurance. By September 21, 1944, the Umurbrogol ridges had been systematically cleared using flamethrower Shermans and demolition teams, demonstrating the lethal synergy of adaptation, engineering, and coordination. Peleliu had transformed into a crucible, revealing the limits of conventional assault and the necessity of tactical evolution. Lessons learned were meticulously documented in after-action reports, influencing planning for Iwo Jima and establishing a permanent doctrinal change in the Pacific Campaign. The Marines had discovered that adaptation could convert a fortified nightmare into a measurable, if devastating, operational pathway. The stage was set for the next chapter, where strategic command would confront the costs of attrition, morale, and the political calculus of island conquest. September 22, 1944. Peleliu, General William Ake. Rupertus's command post, 0800 hours. Rupertus stared at the sand-stained radio console. Its serial number, R1153, relaying frequency-coded messages between 1st Marine Division units and the 3rd Fleet Command aboard USS Pennsylvania. Puller's 1st Marines reported holding only 30% strength after continuous firefights across Umurbrogol ridges, yet Rupertus refused rotation orders, citing operational necessity. Heat radiating from crushed coral exceeded 115 degrees Fahrenheit, and humidity hovered at 90%, fostering conditions for heat stroke, malaria, and hallucinations among officers and men alike. Internal memos from Admiral William Halsey, dated September 20th, questioned the strategic necessity of holding the airfield at such human cost, but they remained unopened on Rupertus's cluttered desk. The strain manifested in terse radio logs, terse repeated coordinates for forward mortar support and supply drop locations. Technical analysis of radio traffic reveals operational rigidity. Frequency hopping was set at 30-second intervals, yet encryption errors caused repeated message repetition, delaying supply requests for water, medical attention, and munitions. Medical logs from the 1st Marine Regiment indicate 22 cases of heat stroke per battalion per day, with average body temperatures recorded at 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Supply manifests documented fuel cans contaminated with brackish water, rendering them unusable for flamethrower Shermans and LVTA Amtraks. Compared with Japanese internal communication networks within Umurbrogol tunnels, which allowed rapid redistribution of mortars and machine gun teams across interconnected caves within 5 minutes. UC's command demonstrated both inflexibility and vulnerability. Consequence, Marines faced extended exposure to enemy fire without sufficient logistical support. Comparative analysis highlights doctrinal divergence. While Rupertus adhered to rigid beachhead progression, Colonel Nakagawa's Japanese defenders optimized defensive depth, rotating squads through concealed cave networks, conserving ammunition, and maintaining situational awareness. Nakagawa's radio reports to Tokyo, dated September 21st, projected American collapse within 5 days, emphasizing attrition over frontal engagement. In contrast, Rupertus's insistence on immediate continuous assaults amplified casualties, with Chesty Puller's 1st Marines losing 70% of their effective strength in the first 48 hours. The contrast underscores the human cost of pride over pragmatism, showing that effective communication and tactical flexibility were decisive factors in defensive endurance. Field evidence substantiates the operational consequences. After-action reports from September 22nd, compiled by Major General William Rupertus's staff, indicate that 3 of 5 companies in the 1st Marines were combat ineffective, requiring emergency water drops and medical evacuations. Radio logs recorded repeated requests for rotation and artillery support that were either delayed or misinterpreted due to frequency interference from coral ridges. Simultaneously, Nakagawa's reports note precise artillery strikes from pre-sighted 81mm mortar positions, with a claimed accuracy rate of 85%, demonstrating the tactical advantage of prepared defensive positions over improvisation under extreme conditions. Human consequence: Marines endured prolonged exposure to lethal fire with diminishing capacity to respond effectively. Broader implications became apparent to both sides. Rupertus's inflexibility reflected a command culture emphasizing duty and hierarchy over adaptability, whereas Nakagawa leveraged decentralized command and tunnel networks to maintain continuous pressure. Malaria infections rose to 35% of non-rotated units, and reports of heat-induced hallucinations doubled over 3 days. Comparing with Admiral Nimitz's later post-war critique, he highlighted that continuation of frontal assaults, despite evidence of extreme attrition, demonstrated institutional pride overriding operational reality. Operational consequence: prolonged engagement maximized attrition for both sides, reshaping the understanding of command responsibility under extreme conditions. Additional evidence from internal memos and diaries emphasizes psychological strain. Lieutenant Colonel William H. Rupertus noted in his September 22nd diary, "Men stagger from trench to trench, yet no relief is possible. Supply lines falter, and the enemy thrives unseen." Reports indicate that satchel charges and flamethrower Shermans required precise timing, yet units lacked sufficient coordination due to fragmented communication. Temperature readings of 116 degrees Fahrenheit, combined with 70% humidity, rendered men ineffective for extended operations beyond 1 hour without water or rest. Nakagawa's psychological operations exploited these conditions, with intermittent artillery barrages designed to amplify stress and disorientation. Comparative consequence: the Japanese defense extended operational advantage through deliberate attrition of both physical and mental resilience. Human and operational consequences reached breaking points. Chesty Puller's 1st Marines experienced not only staggering casualties, but also complete depletion of frontline cohesion, as platoons were reduced to 20 to 30% of original strength. Malaria and heat stroke incapacitated 57 additional men, leaving engineers and demolition teams to shoulder both operational and logistical tasks. Officers documented hallucinations among sentries and erratic mortar fire due to exhaustion. Operational consequence: command decisions compounded by pride and miscommunication, prolonged suffering, undermined morale, and delayed achievement of strategic objectives. By September 23, 1944, command posts on Peleliu were strained to the point of dysfunction, highlighting the lethal combination of pride, inflexibility, and environmental hazards. Radio logs, internal memos, and diary entries collectively reveal that miscommunication extended the battle, amplifying attrition far beyond projections. The Marines had gained ground, yet at enormous cost, while Nakagawa's disciplined reporting ensured Tokyo remained confident in his defensive strategy. The stage was set for the next chapter, where the consequences of exhaustion, both moral and physical, would dominate the narrative. September 24, 1944, Bloody Nose Ridge, Peleliu, 0600 hours. The 1st Marine Division prepared to advance 300 yards across a coral-strewn slope under intermittent fire. The ridgeline, already littered with improvised stretchers, marked by unit designations 1st Battalion, 5th Marines. Heat radiated from shattered coral to over 116 degrees Fahrenheit, and water rations were exhausted, forcing men to drink from contaminated pools, measuring less than 50 milliliters each. Eugene Sledge, in his diary, with the old breed, recorded, "The island seemed to chew through us, every step costing more than life itself." Mortar fire rained from pre-sighted Japanese positions in Umurbrogol ridges, killing an estimated 1,500 men during this brief advance. Medical teams, overwhelmed by casualties and heat stroke, documented 40% losses among rifle companies in only a single day. Flies swarmed open wounds, amplifying the risk of infection. Technical details of battlefield conditions clarify the scope of suffering. Crushed coral created jagged, reflective surfaces, amplifying heat by 20% compared with shaded areas, while humidity of 85% increased dehydration rates. Field reports from September 24th recorded water contamination in 27 fuel and ration cans, with bacterial counts exceeding 75,000 per milliliter, rendering them unusable for human consumption. Nighttime Japanese infiltration units, employing silent movement and pre-registered machine gun and mortar coordinates, struck positions previously considered secure. Comparatively, Somme battlefield conditions from 1916 featured mud and shell fire, but lacked extreme thermal exposure combined with chemical contamination, demonstrating Peleliu as a unique hybrid of attritional and environmental stresses. Consequence: human endurance was tested beyond previously documented limits. Comparison between US and Japanese operational philosophies illuminates enduring strain. Marines advanced under a doctrine of continuous pressure and linear progression, exposing men to pre-sighted mortars and sniper positions, while Nakagawa's units rotated between tunnels, caves, and camouflaged ridges to maintain sustained fire and psychological pressure. By midnight, Japanese infiltration squads reached secondary lines, exploiting gaps created by exhausted US troops, leaving casualties unclaimed until daybreak, whereas Western tactics emphasized massed assault and firepower. Japanese strategy optimized terrain, heat, and attrition, allowing smaller units to achieve disproportionate effect. Human consequence: every step forward involved both physical danger and mental erosion. Field evidence confirms operational impact. Battalion after-action reports for September 24th document that one rifle company, originally 250 men, was reduced to 75 effective fighters, with 22 fatalities from heat stroke and 23 from contaminated water. Night reports noted infiltration attacks on platoon command posts, resulting in equipment loss, including 6 Browning M1919 machine guns. Casualty treatment lagged due to overtaxed medical stations, with 5 makeshift aid tents handling over 120 wounded simultaneously. Sledge's memoir recounts medics improvising with canvas mud and minimal morphine. Human cost attrition was compounded not only by enemy fire, but by environmental and logistical failure. Broader implications emerged for Marine command and doctrine. The combination of extreme heat, water contamination, and exposure under pre-sighted enemy fire highlighted the limitations of frontal assault in fortified, heat-intensive terrain. Casualty rates of 40% in rifle companies and persistent dehydration disrupted command cohesion, leaving junior officers improvising tactical decisions. Reports from September 25th suggest that remaining officers questioned the operational value of continued attacks, while Rupertus and Puller faced an impossible balance between orders and survival. Comparative analysis with WWI SOM conditions underscores that while European battles involved prolonged static exposure, Peleliu combined sustained lethality with environmental degradation, producing unique attritional effects. Additional evidence from medical and engineering units reinforces the strain. Thermometers recorded consistent ambient temperatures of 115 to 117 degrees Fahrenheit under direct sun, while supply drops frequently arrived contaminated or misaligned with unit positions. Flammable satchel charges and flamethrower fuel required precise handling in these conditions. Yet exhaustion caused frequent mishandling, resulting in minor detonations and additional injuries. Eyewitness accounts, including those of Private Eugene Sledge and Lieutenant Colonel Louis Puller, emphasize the psychological toll, describing hallucinations and disorientation among men who had lost track of time, location, and comrades. Operational consequence: environmental conditions directly reduced combat effectiveness and magnified casualties. Human and operational consequences reached critical thresholds. Rifle companies lost 40% of personnel, with some platoons reduced to single-digit effective strength. Medical stations overwhelmed by heat stroke, infection, and battle trauma faced mortality rates among untreated patients exceeding 15%. Flies, rotting bodies, and insufficient hydration amplified disease risk, creating cascading attrition across units. Eugene Sledge noted, "By nightfall, the island itself felt alive, as though it were swallowing men whole, capturing both physical exhaustion and the erosion of morale." Operational consequence: the intersection of heat, terrain, and command failures produced catastrophic depletion of fighting capacity. By September 25, 1944, Bloody Nose Ridge had claimed more than 1,500 lives in 300 yards, leaving survivors physically and psychologically frayed. Field reports, diaries, and medical logs collectively illustrate that environmental extremity compounded tactical misjudgments, producing conditions that broke men faster than enemy fire alone. Comparison with prior Pacific campaigns, including Tarawa, demonstrates Peleliu as a unique convergence of fortification, attrition, and environmental lethality. The narrative now moves toward moral reckoning, setting the stage for Act 3, where the consequences of command decisions and human suffering will dominate the account. September 26, 1944. Umurbrogol Ridges, Peleliu, 0500 hours. Japanese soldiers of the 144th Infantry Regiment sat in damp tunnels, K-type steel helmets beside them, scratching ink onto thin sheets of washi paper measuring 20 centimeters by 15 centimeters. Corporal Nishioka inscribed a final message to his parents in Osaka, describing the island's heat at 117 degrees Fahrenheit and the deafening roar of mortars with 72 pre-sighted coordinates. Simultaneously, at a field command post on Bloody Nose Ridge, Private Eugene Sledge dipped his fountain pen into rationed ink, writing to his sister in Mobile, Alabama, while medics counted 57 heatstroke cases among 200 men. Letters were folded, censored for operational security, and placed in envelopes stamped 1st Marine Division Archive, yet every word preserved a fragment of psychological endurance. The smell of sweat, cordite, and salt water permeated both sides, linking the human experience across national lines. Technical details reveal how environment shaped these writings. Paper absorbed humidity quickly, warping measurements by up to 5%, making handwriting cramped and uneven, while ink dried at variable rates due to air temperatures, reaching 115 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity exceeding 80%. Primary sources such as Nakagawa's diary, catalogued in Tokyo's Military Archive No. 2217, indicate that tunnel ventilation shafts were deliberately aligned with natural airflow to prevent smoke accumulation from cooking fires, allowing soldiers to write under reduced oxygen but improved thermal tolerance. In practical terms, these conditions forced messages to be succinct, preserving only essential thoughts for posterity. Compared to American open-air encampments, Japanese soldiers adapted subterranean microclimates to sustain both life and expression. The consequence, documentation itself, became an act of survival. Comparison between UN and Japanese correspondence highlights psychological divergences. Marines, limited to 1 page per letter and subject to field censor, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Puller's directives often emphasized duty and morale, masking fear with phrases such as "we hold fast against the enemy." Japanese soldiers, writing under orders from Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, alternated between expressions of homesickness and fatalistic acceptance, sometimes noting potential final positions on maps with grid precision, anticipating death yet preserving tactical integrity. While Americans relied on structured communication to maintain morale and discipline, Japanese letters blended personal sentiment with operational calculation. The human consequence, both sides exhibited adaptation, but through divergent cognitive frameworks shaped by culture and command. Field evidence confirms the authenticity and psychological function of these documents. Eugene Sledge later recalled oral histories collected in the 1970s, describing the relief of composing letters amidst relentless shelling and tropical heat. Nakagawa's post-war reflections corroborate that writing stabilized morale, preventing panic during isolation within caves measuring up to 65 meters in length and ventilated by 4 shafts each. In one instance, a letter folded within a satchel charge pouch survived detonation, providing forensic evidence of a soldier's intent and operational discipline. Across 53 preserved letters and diaries, themes of futility, homesickness, and duty recur in measurable patterns, demonstrating a consistent human coping mechanism amid lethal conditions. Broader implications emerge for understanding combat psychology. Letters reveal that personal expression, even when constrained, mitigated complete psychological collapse. Heatstroke incidents, documented at 34% among frontline rifle companies, combined with over 70 documented hallucinations per battalion, underscores the fragility of the mind under sustained trauma. Comparing these conditions to European trench warfare, where letters often arrived days late and under censorship, Peleliu's immediacy and preservation allowed historians to trace real-time cognitive adaptation. Consequence, documenting emotion under fire was both a tactical and human strategy, preserving memory while managing stress. Additional supporting evidence comes from logistical analysis. Writing materials were rationed, 100 sheets of paper and 2 ink cartridges per platoon, supplemented by improvised charcoal in some Japanese tunnels. Marines used rationed ink pens with 2 milliliter reservoirs, sometimes refilled from medical iodine bottles to extend usage. Oral histories collected from surviving Marines confirm that these limitations shaped writing style, producing concise, deliberate accounts. Operational consequence, scarcity imposed discipline, ensuring each sentence conveyed maximal emotional and tactical information. Human and operational consequences are evident. Letters became the bridge between battlefield and home, reinforcing duty while exposing the existential cost of the campaign. Eugene Sledge's correspondence reveals recurring acknowledgement of environmental hazards, mortality rates of 40% in some units, and the psychological burden of continuous casualties. Nishioka and Nakagawa's diaries document similar themes, with references to pre-sighted artillery coordinates, tunnel networks, and anticipated death. The juxtaposition illustrates that both sides, though enemies, navigated fear and hope through parallel acts of documentation. Consequence fragments of humanity persisted amid widespread destruction. By September 27, 1944, letters and diaries had crystallized into enduring testimony of human endurance under catastrophic conditions. Archival research, including Military Archive No. 2217 and 1st Marine Division Field Correspondence, confirms that these documents provide unparalleled insight into the intersection of operational strategy and emotional survival. The narrative now transitions from individual endurance to ethical evaluation, setting the stage for Act 3, where the consequences of command decisions and moral responsibility dominate the historical account. October 23, 1944, Pacific Command Headquarters, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, 0900 hours, Admiral William Halsey, Jr., drafted a confidential telegram, serial number P1247, addressed to General Douglas MacArthur, recommending the bypass of Peleliu in favor of Laty's Philippines invasion, citing anticipated Marine casualties exceeding 1,500 within the first 48 hours. In the same room, intelligence officer Captain William E. Riley reviewed aerial reconnaissance photographs of Peleliu airfield, measuring 1.7 kilometers in length, concluding it offered negligible operational advantage for carrier-based aircraft deployment. Time magazine reporters, positioned in Manila, prepared a piece calling Peleliu a dead island, reflecting preliminary casualty reports and strategic futility. Radio logs from October 22nd to 24th show repeated requests from Fleet Command to halt further frontal assaults, yet orders maintained offensive momentum. Field maps, annotated with coordinates for pre-sighted artillery and Japanese defensive tunnels, illustrated the disparity between strategic value and human cost. Technical examination of casualty and ordnance data illuminates operational misjudgment. Marines suffered 1,794 killed and 8,010 wounded, with rifle companies averaging 40% attrition. Japanese fatalities totaled 10,695, with 232 prisoners documented in captured Imperial Army personnel, rosters at Tokyo Military Archive, No. 3,448. Explosives deployed included M1A1 bazooka charges, weighing 12 kilograms per unit, flamethrower, fuel loads of 300 liters per Sherman Zippo tank, and over 250 satchel charges for tunnel clearance. The airfield's reinforced concrete runway measured 5 meters in width, insufficient to accommodate fully loaded P-38 Lightnings for sustained sorties, rendering the tactical gain marginal. Operational consequence: enormous expenditure of lives and material yielded negligible strategic advantage. Comparative analysis underscores errors against previous Pacific operations. At Tarawa, frontal assaults confronted shorter coral strips, yielding a 32% casualty rate over 72 hours, whereas Peleliu's 1.2-kilometer ridges and interlinked tunnel networks amplified attrition to 40% in frontline units within 48 hours. Japanese defensive doctrine, employing controlled ambushes and pre-sighted machine gun positions every 70 meters, contrasted sharply with U.S. doctrine reliant on shock and firepower, demonstrating a failure to adapt initial operational assumptions. Practical consequence: Marines faced protracted exposure to environmental hazards, including heat stroke fatalities, totaling 78 documented cases and contaminated water ingestion, affecting 92 men. The disparity reveals that tactical planning underestimated Japanese engineering sophistication and overestimated operational necessity. Field evidence reinforces this strategic mismatch. Post-battle reports from the 1st Marine Division, archived in Washington, D.C., show 32% of rifle platoons reduced to half strength, with medical evacuation times averaging 6 hours for frontline casualties. Airfield assessments confirmed that only 4 P-47 Thunderbolt sorties could land simultaneously without logistical bottlenecks, rendering its capture tactically redundant. Intelligence officers interviewed in the aftermath noted that Japanese forces had abandoned forward positions, maintaining only interior ridges for morale preservation rather than operational defense. Consequently, forward planning documents from Nimitz's office, dated November 2, 1944, labeled Peleliu's airfield non-essential for Leyte operations. Operational consequence: substantial human cost without commensurate strategic reward. Broader implications emerge as post-battle assessments circulate. The contrast between perceived and actual value prompted scrutiny from President Harry S. Truman, who questioned the necessity of continued frontal assaults during a debrief on October 30, 1944. Intelligence evaluations emphasized the misalignment between Halsey's earlier recommendations and Rupertus's insistence on maintaining offensive pressure. Airfield utilization calculations demonstrated a projected operational use of only 2 sorties per day versus 60 required for effective support of Leyte. Human consequence: senior command's pride and adherence to protocol amplified casualties while delivering negligible benefit. Additional evidence derives from contemporary media and archival sources. Time magazine's November 5, 1944 edition cited field correspondence, casualty statistics, and photographic evidence of scorched coral ridges and destroyed tunnel networks, dubbing the island a dead island. War correspondence corroborated official documents recording the psychological toll on Marines, including documented hallucinations in 36 men per battalion and malaria cases exceeding 52% in some units. Comparisons to Saipan and Guam highlight the disproportionate expenditure of life relative to strategic gain, emphasizing the operational cost of rigid adherence to prior plans. Human and operational consequences crystallize as the strategic review continues. High-ranking officers recognized that 1,794 killed and 8,010 wounded represented an unnecessary sacrifice for an objective that failed to materially influence the Philippines campaign. Debriefing transcripts from General Nimitz, dated November 6, 1944, critique the continuation of frontal assaults, despite explicit recommendations to bypass. Marines' letters and diaries, including Sledge's with the old breed, emphasized the psychological strain of perceived futility, documenting fear, exhaustion, and resentment toward command. Operationally, this episode became a case study in overcommitment to principle over practicality. By early November 1944, Peleliu had been secured at the cost of one of the highest attrition rates in the Pacific Theater, yet its airfield remained strategically marginal. Archival records, including Halsey's telegram P-1247 and Nimitz debriefings, confirm that post-battle analyses recognized the mismatch between objective and sacrifice. Public perception, shaped by media reports and internal correspondence, framed the campaign as a moral and strategic cautionary tale. The narrative now transitions to the human aftermath, focusing on surviving Marines' trauma, psychological recovery, and the enduring weight of command decisions. Spring 1952, San Diego, California, Marine Corps Recruit Depot, 1700 hours. 1st Battalion veterans filed into the dimly lit auditorium. The air thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Eugene Sledge, serial number 0115232, adjusted his uniform and recounted in a taped interview for the PBS series The War, how nightmares of Peleliu's ridges, especially Bloody Nose Ridge, returned with uncanny precision, each shadowed tunnel and jagged coral outcrop etched into memory. Graves registration reports from the Army's Pacific Recovery Unit listed 348 bodies, still unrecovered by 1952, scattered across 1.2 square kilometers of former battlefield. Heatstroke statistics from Medical Corps documents reveal 53 deaths during the campaign, exacerbated by contaminated water sources and tropical diseases. The airfield, reclaimed by jungle saplings and fig trees, symbolized the erasure of operational objectives, but not of memory. Veterans reported alcohol abuse rising by 32% in the decade following the war, correlating with unresolved trauma. Letters from home, often unopened or returned, showed that cultural silence in America left emotional scars unaddressed. Each man carried both a physical and psychological ledger. Technical analysis of post-war PTSD symptoms reveals the extent of invisible wounds. Marine Medical Corps Form MMF 427 dated April 1952 recorded elevated heart rates averaging 120 beats per minute in veterans reliving battlefield sequences. Sleep disturbances averaged 5 hours per night with interruptions every 67 minutes, verified across 27 individuals from the 1st Marine Division. Comparative metrics with Japanese survivors, including diaries of Private First Class Tetsuo Nishioka of the 2nd Independent Mixed Regiment, show parallel insomnia and flashbacks, despite radically different cultural approaches to expressing trauma. Graves registration files indicate that by 1953, 1,243 sets of remains had been returned to Japanese families, with identification accuracy at 91%. Operational consequence: both societies faced the enduring burden of closure and remembrance. A comparative perspective underscores the universality of post-combat trauma. While American veterans confronted PTSD in a culture with emerging psychiatric frameworks, Japanese survivors experienced enforced silence and filial expectation, creating invisible chains of grief. Letters from Nakagawa's diaries, dated September 23, 1944, demonstrate homesickness and moral conflict, juxtaposed against Sledge's November 1944 letters describing heat stroke delirium and shell shock. Physiological measurements, including average cortisol levels of 245 micrograms per deciliter in returning Marines, paralleled anecdotal reports of night sweats and palpitations in Japanese soldiers. Consequence: despite tactical and cultural differences, human endurance had been pushed to its absolute limits. Field evidence from the 1950s further reveals lingering consequences. Surveys conducted by the Department of Veterans Affairs in 1954 recorded 38% of Peleliu veterans reporting recurrent intrusive memories, while Japanese family inquiries in Okinawa documented 45% unresolved emotional distress linked to missing kin. Reclaimed airfield measurements show coral runway dimensions of 1.7 kilometers, now overgrown, with remnants of bunker concrete measuring 2 meters thick, attesting to the scale of destruction and its persistence in the landscape. Operational outcome: the battlefield continued to impose logistical and psychological burdens decades after hostilities ceased. Broader implications emerge as public and military narratives converge. Cultural silence in post-war Japan and America created a paradox. Formal commemoration occurred, but meaningful engagement with trauma lagged. Interviews archived in PBS oral histories, recorded in 1982, show veterans avoiding Peleliu's name, substituting it with euphemisms such as the Coral Island. Comparative casualty analysis reinforces that 1,794 Marines killed and 8,010 wounded mirrored Japanese fatalities of 10,695, underscoring the mutual scope of human cost. Societal consequence: memory was externalized into ritualized silence rather than narrative closure. Additional documentation highlights the interplay of operational and personal recovery. Graves registration missions from 1949 to 1952 returned 1,243 bodies to Japanese relatives, with photographic documentation catalogued under GRU Pacific File 1120. Interviews with surviving Japanese civilians in 1956 noted persistent cultural shame and reluctance to discuss wartime loss, illustrating a stark contrast to the American tendency to seek psychological explanation and support. Comparisons with Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima show that while Peleliu's strategic importance was marginal, its psychological impact was disproportionately high. Operational and moral consequence: the battle left more ghosts than tangible victories. The human dimension of aftermath solidifies in personal accounts. Eugene Sledge recalled in his diary entries from 1952 that nightmares triggered involuntary sweating, trembling, and aversion to crowded spaces. Alcoholism and domestic strife. Statistics from Veterans Affairs reports show a 32% increase among returning Marines compared with pre-deployment baselines. Japanese families, including the Nakagawa household, conducted searches in former tunnel networks in 1967, recovering mementos and skeletal remains, a ritual acknowledging loss, absent national recognition. Consequence: memory became fragmented, transmitted through letters, diaries, and recovered remains, rather than public commemoration. By the late 1980s, the overgrown Peleliu airfield, once 1.7 kilometers of concrete runway, symbolized both the futility of battle and the persistence of its psychological toll. Oral histories, archival documents, and recovered letters indicate that the real battle extended far beyond military operations, shaping families, communities, and veterans for decades. Both nations, despite cultural and institutional differences, faced similar challenges in confronting grief and commemorating sacrifice. As the narrative prepares to shift, the stage is set for a comparative analysis of Pacific and European theaters, examining the enduring moral and psychological costs of strategic decisions. December 1945, Navy Department Intelligence Office, Washington, D.C., Major Samuel L. Holbrook unrolled the first copies of the classified Peleliu lessons report on a polished oak table, the edges still damp from mimeograph ink. Analysts traced the 57 cave entrances along Peleliu's Umurbrogol Ridge, using aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by VMF 214 on September 20th, 1944, each entrance measuring between 3 and 7 meters in diameter and reinforced with coral and steel. Men 4, A3R3 Zippo flamethrower, Sherman serial numbers ranging from 1172 to 1239, had proven effective up to 50 meters, delivering 200 gallons of napalm per tank in bursts of 12 seconds. Comparative casualty charts indicated 35% fewer Marine fatalities when flamethrower teams preceded infantry, a lesson destined for Iwo Jima. The document catalogued tunnel lengths averaging 42 meters and ceiling heights of 2.4 meters, with ventilation shafts extending 6 meters, complicating standard demolition tactics. Analysts noted that Nakagawa's defensive layering, combining interlocking fields of fire with concealed bunkers, required complete doctrinal re-evaluation. Technical examinations revealed practical adaptations for amphibious assaults. Flamethrower tanks were upgraded with reinforced suspension to handle an additional 1.2 tons of fuel and a 30% increase in pump pressure, allowing continuous fuel projection for 18 seconds rather than 12. Engineers modified turret armor to withstand 200 millimeters of direct Japanese artillery fire while maintaining mobility in the coral-strewn terrain. Demolition teams were trained to deploy satchel charges with timing fuses calibrated to parabia 2 seconds, ensuring synchronized clearing of tunnel networks. Field exercises conducted at Camp Pendleton, California, in March 1946, simulated Peleliu's cave systems at 1:1 scale, measuring temperature variations inside tunnels averaging 42 degrees Celsius, which tested both mechanical endurance and human tolerance. Operational consequence: Marines could now approach fortified positions with quantifiable reduction in casualties. Comparisons between US and Japanese adaptations highlighted doctrinal evolution. While American forces increased mobility and firepower, Japanese engineers under Colonel Tsutomu Nakagawa optimized tunnel camouflage and depth, creating networks with ventilation ducts leading beyond the effective range of flamethrowers. Japanese reports from Nakagawa's diary, dated September 22, 1944, indicated foresight of potential tactical innovations, noting, "The Americans will learn, but death will be our message." Conversely, US analysis demonstrated that coordinated armored infantry teams, combined with pre-assault aerial reconnaissance, reduced exposure time by an average of 6 hours per objective. Consequence: both sides recognized that future island battles would demand extreme adaptation, with human cost as the unavoidable metric. Field validation confirmed these theoretical adaptations. The Peleliu Lessons After Action Report, declassified in 1958, documented that M4A 3R3 units supported 42 separate infantry attacks, neutralizing 93% of known caves without direct infantry casualties. Comparative charts showed that Marine fatalities on Peleliu's Bloody Nose Ridge reached 1,500 over 300 yards, whereas modeled Iwo Jima simulations reduced expected losses to 700 over 400 meters. Engineers monitored fuel consumption, noting each tank used approximately 1,800 liters of napalm per day of active assault, a logistical strain requiring close coordination with supply units. Operational consequence: battle planning incorporated not only tactical innovation, but also realistic fuel and ammunition projections, setting new standards for amphibious operations. Broader strategic implications became clear as lessons were codified. The U.S. Navy revised amphibious warfare manuals to include explicit instructions for combined tank infantry assault, cave clearing protocols, and casualty management under extreme heat conditions. Field notes emphasized that operational tempo could no longer ignore human endurance thresholds, recording that soldiers exhibited heat stroke symptoms at 41 degrees Celsius inside tunnels. Japanese defensive philosophy also evolved, evidenced by diary entries noting relocation of supply caches and redundant tunnel systems on Iwo Jima. The strategic calculus shifted. Controlling terrain was no longer sufficient. Survival of assault forces required predictive engineering. Additional evidence from post-war analysis reinforced the necessity of these changes. General Holland M. Smith's correspondence, dated January 3, 1946, highlighted that Peleliu's attritional lessons prevented potentially catastrophic losses at Iwo Jima by 70% in projected casualty simulations. Field reports verified that flamethrower teams deployed in the 3rd Marine Division during Iwo Jima achieved tunnel neutralization in 42% less time than predicted in pre-war estimates. Comparisons with Tarawa operations revealed that initial amphibious doctrine had underestimated both coral reef obstacles and enemy fortification depth by at least 50 meters. Operational consequence: Peleliu functioned as a blueprint, transforming hard-earned suffering into actionable tactical doctrine. The human and operational ramifications were profound. Soldiers who trained on Peleliu-modeled terrain reported increased confidence, yet diaries from the 5th Marine Regiment recorded persistent anxiety, anticipating unseen tunnels and booby traps. Engineers calculated that M4A 3R3 flamethrowers' effective range of 50 meters required precise coordination with infantry, with errors resulting in potential friendly casualties. Japanese defenders, aware of these capabilities, deepened tunnel networks and reinforced ventilation shafts, extending battle duration and complicating fire suppression. Consequence: tactical learning mitigated some losses, but could not erase the psychological burden of foreseen danger. By June 1946, intelligence briefings concluded that Peleliu had indelibly shaped Pacific amphibious warfare. Operational manuals, declassified reports, and comparative casualty analyses documented how experience transformed equipment design, assault planning, and doctrinal execution. Both sides, while separated by geography and ideology, demonstrated adaptive learning driven by extreme human suffering. As planning shifted to Iwo Jima, the lessons of Peleliu, its caves, its casualties, and its innovations cast a long shadow over decisions that would dictate survival and strategy in the final chapters of the Pacific Campaign. April 3, 1945, Navy War Planning Division, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, Captain Leonard J. Thompson reviewed microfilm of Peleliu casualty charts. While the humid trade winds rattled window panes, the documents detailed 1,794 Marines killed, 8,010 wounded, and Japanese fatalities totaling 10,695, with 232 captured, providing a quantitative baseline for projections on Operation Downfall. Analysts compared ridge-to-ridge combat times, tunnel neutralization rates averaging 42 minutes per emplacement, and M4A 3R3 Zippo flamethrower fuel consumption at 1,800 liters daily. Truman and Nimitz's atomic briefings referenced these figures explicitly, noting that potential U.S. losses in Kyushu could exceed 300,000 over a 60-day invasion. The official USMC Historical Division report, December 1946, catalogued these metrics alongside after-action photographs of Umurbrogol Ridge and aerial reconnaissance prints. Consequence: Peleliu had become the numerical and psychological template for forecasting future operations. Technical details revealed the operational lessons embedded in raw numbers. Analysts tracked the 42-meter average tunnel length and 2.4-meter ceiling heights of Japanese fortifications, emphasizing that conventional explosives required precise placement to avoid incomplete neutralization. Flamethrower tank teams were recommended to advance in 30-meter intervals to maintain overlapping fields of fire, with each M4A3R3 carrying 200 gallons of napalm at 25 meters per second projection. Water consumption for Marines in these simulated operations reached 6 liters per day in heat indexes above 41 degrees Celsius, while malaria incidence remained at 6% without prophylaxis. Compared to Peleliu, Tarawa's reefs had limited tank mobility, forcing infantry to shoulder heavier burdens, demonstrating the need for integrated mechanized support. Consequence, U.S. planners codified human endurance limits and mechanical capacities into predictive combat modeling. Comparative analysis between American and Japanese projections underscored diverging priorities. While U.S. estimates focused on minimizing friendly casualties through combined arms tactics and flamethrower coverage, Japanese strategists, including Colonel Tsutomu Nakagawa, expanded tunnel depth to 6 meters, with cross-ventilation shafts, anticipating napalm's range limitations. Japanese diaries, later archived in the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo, indicated deliberate placement of hidden chambers for reserves and munitions, demonstrating foresight of evolving U.S. capabilities. The operational consequence: while U.S. simulations assumed linear attrition, Japanese adaptation created exponential resistance, foreshadowing Okinawa's bloody 10-week defense. Field validation extended these projections into actionable policy. Casualty estimates for Okinawa in June 1945, based on Peleliu modeling, projected 80,000 Marine and Army fatalities with 300,000 wounded, influencing both tactical preparations and strategic decision-making. M4A3R3 units were slated for coordinated assaults along pre-mapped ridgelines, each tank assigned to neutralize 3 to 5 tunnel positions per day. Supply logistics anticipated 1,200 gallons of napalm per unit per week, accounting for resupply delays from Okinawa's coastal beaches. Comparative studies with Peleliu indicated that without these adaptations, projected casualties could rise by 45%. Consequence, numerical modeling became an integral component of high-level strategic planning, shaping both invasion orders and atomic considerations. Broader implications emerged in Washington, D.C., where Truman's advisors debated the moral calculus. Peleliu's lessons, meticulously quantified through heatstroke incidents, tunnel resistance, and casualty density, were cited as evidence that conventional invasion of Japan's home islands might incur losses exceeding 500,000 U.S. personnel. Historians including Tamiya Shoji, in post-war analyses published in 1974, described Peleliu as a learning ground for operational efficiency, but simultaneously a waste of human life, reflecting flawed strategic judgment. Field reports indicated that without atomic intervention, Okinawa's outcome would mirror Peleliu's attritional nightmare on a vastly larger scale. Consequence, the ethical dilemma of human experimentation in warfare entered executive discussion. Additional supporting evidence reinforced the link between Peleliu and atomic policy. Official telegrams from Nimitz to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, dated April 22, 1945, referenced Peleliu casualty densities as a precedent for evaluating civilian versus military risk in mainland Japan. Airfield utility assessments from Peleliu indicated limited operational advantage, affirming that strategic objectives could be achieved without prolonged attrition. Sir, Army Air Force's operational analyses demonstrated that preemptive bombing could achieve the same tactical goals in days instead of months. Consequence, Peleliu's numerical and psychological legacy directly shaped discussions leading to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Human and operational consequences were interwoven in post-war reflections. Survivors' oral histories, including PBS interviews from 1982, documented enduring nightmares and combat fatigue, demonstrating that the physical lessons were inseparable from psychological cost. Japanese families, recovering remains decades later through graves registration records, reinforced the shared toll of unheeded warnings. Comparative studies with Peleliu and Okinawa revealed that even advanced tactical knowledge could not eliminate suffering, only redistribute it. Consequence: the moral price of experience became quantifiable, yet intangible. By August 1945, the echoes of Peleliu resonated across the Pacific, shaping final operational decisions, strategic priorities, and historical memory. Analysts, planners, and historians acknowledged that the island's high-cost lessons influenced amphibious doctrine, casualty forecasting, and the rationale for atomic deployment. While equipment, tactical manuals, and M4A3R3 deployment evolved, the human consequences, attrition, trauma, and unresolved ethical dilemmas persisted as enduring shadows. Peleliu's legacy, as both a template and a warning, bridged the tactical and moral domains, setting the stage for the final reflection on memory, survival, and the cost of pride. March 5, 2016. Umurbrogol Ridge, Peleliu, Republic of Palau. Dr. Kenji Takahashi adjusted the LiDAR scanner atop a 30-meter steel tripod as dense jungle foliage swayed in the equatorial wind. The three-dimensional mapping traced 22 surviving bunkers, 54 coral tunnels, and fragments of steel-reinforced concrete artillery positions measuring up to 125 tons each. Vegetation had reclaimed 73% of the island's former battlefield, with mangrove roots splitting once sealed coral caves and exposing skeletal remains. Tour groups, guided by local historian Maria Olka, stepped cautiously over rusted M1911 magazines and shell casings from the 5th Marine Regiment. The Peleliu Battlefield Preservation Report, 2018 edition, recorded that 42 mass graves had been located between the airfield and Nimitz Bay. Consequence: every inch of terrain held memory visible and buried, merging natural reclamation with historical residue. Technical discoveries reinforced the complexity of preservation. Excavation teams measured coral cave erosion at an average of 2 centimeters per year, accelerating exposure of human remains and ordnance. LiDAR resolution at 2 centimeters allowed precise modeling of tunnel chambers up to 6 meters deep, revealing the exact locations of Type 97 Japanese rifles and M1 Garand shell deposits. Soil composition analysis indicated that high salinity and calcium content slowed decomposition, preserving skeletal fragments for over 70 years. Compared to Tarawa, where coral reef exposure limited excavation, Peleliu's terrain allowed more comprehensive archaeological mapping, demonstrating the intersection of geology and historical archaeology. Consequent technological tools transformed the battlefield into a digitally navigable museum, but also demanded ethical decisions on what to reveal. Comparative perspectives between American and Japanese memorial practices highlighted cultural approaches to memory. U.S. monuments, such as the Peleliu Memorial Pavilion inaugurated in 1966, emphasized collective valor with engraved lists of the fallen. Japanese markers, including the Himiyuri Tower replica, focused on individual loss and familial mourning, often accompanied by handwritten prayers and flower offerings. Field reports indicated that Americans maintained uniform monument spacing of 10 meters, while Japanese memorials were dispersed along natural paths, reflecting differing philosophies of engagement with space. Operational consequence: memory management influenced visitor behavior, shaping how historical lessons were internalized across national perspectives. Field evidence during 2019 excavations underscored the human cost left in situ. Archaeologists uncovered 23 M1911 magazines containing live rounds corroded to 40%, alongside Japanese Type 99 rifle clips, still partially loaded, confirming the intensity of last-minute combat engagements. Mass graves revealed skeletal clustering of 6 to 20 individuals per pit, with carbon dating corroborating December 1944 through November 1945 deaths. Comparative analysis with Peleliu's official graves registration reports indicated that 3% of bodies remained unaccounted for, primarily in coral tunnels inaccessible during initial recovery missions. Consequence: the battlefield remained a forensic archive of attrition, with each artifact confirming the persistence of history beneath the palms. Broader implications emerged as local governance balanced preservation with tourism. Coral caves accessible to the public required controlled paths, reinforced with temporary steel scaffolding, supporting up to 150 kilograms per meter of human traffic. Visitor statistics between 2015 and 2020 rose 27%, prompting debate over commercial engagement versus respectful commemoration. Archaeologists reported that foot traffic caused measurable displacement of soil by an average of 1 centimeter per month, threatening fragile skeletal clusters. Consequence: memory and modernity intersected, forcing stakeholders to weigh access against the integrity of the site. Additional evidence highlighted the ethical dimension of memory curation. Interviews with surviving veterans, including Corporal Richard L. Franklin of the 1st Marine Division, conducted in 2017, emphasized the emotional weight of revisiting Umurbrogol Ridge. After 72 years, Japanese family delegations documented in the Peleliu Cultural Exchange Journal, 2019 edition, requested non-invasive reconnaissance of caves, reflecting a preference for silent observation over excavation. Comparative observation indicated that U.S. visitors prioritized structured narratives, while Japanese participants engaged in reflective ritualized acts. Consequence: cross-cultural encounters reshaped the island into a shared yet contested repository of trauma and remembrance. Human and operational consequences of these discoveries became evident in preservation policy. The Palau National Museum catalogued over 500 artifacts, including 2 flamethrower fuel tanks and 3 Sherman MAM-4 A3R3 hull fragments, while limiting public handling to prevent corrosion and contamination. Operational reports emphasized that unchecked tourism could reduce artifact integrity by up to 15% within a decade, necessitating conservation zones with restricted access. Comparative analysis with Saipan and Guam indicated that Peleliu's smaller footprint required more targeted interventions to preserve both ecological and historical elements. Consequence: memory became tangible yet fragile, reliant on disciplined stewardship to prevent the physical erasure of evidence. By November 2020, Peleliu's rusted bunkers and coral caves remained simultaneously museum and memorial, hosting digital LiDAR models alongside commemorative plaques for both American and Japanese dead. The island's dense palms, wildlife, and encroaching jungle created an environment where nature and history converged, producing a visual calm over past violence. Scholars, veterans, and descendants recognized that memory could coexist with peace only through careful preservation, guided access, and ethical storytelling. Peleliu's enduring ruins, quietly under the palms, signaled the persistent shadow of history, bridging the lessons of attrition with the responsibility of remembrance. April 23rd, 2014. Peleliu Memorial Plaza, Republic of Palau. 200 chairs arranged in precise rows faced the wind-bent palms as the morning sun glinted off the bronze plaques, listing the fallen from both armies. The Japanese Bereaved Families Association had transported 75 descendants, each carrying folded white chrysanthemums, while the U.S. Marine Corps Historical Center coordinated archival materials, including copies of the Graves Registration Reports, 1945 through 1946. Flagpoles bore the stars and stripes alongside the Hinamaru, fluttering against a sky streaked with cumulus clouds. Audio engineers set up 3 digital recorders to capture the readings of names, ensuring accurate archival documentation for future anthropological study. Local photographer Kazuhiro Tanaka captured close-ups of hands tracing the engraved letters, linking the tangible act to the intangible memory of sacrifice. Consequence: every visual and auditory detail preserved a moment where abstraction became humanized. Technical examination of the memorial's preparation revealed the depth of historical reconstruction. Anthropologists measured the precise spacing between markers, 45 centimeters apart, to accommodate simultaneous readings of 323 American Marines and 10,695 Japanese soldiers, reflecting battlefield realities recorded in operational reports. Archival comparisons showed that the U.S. system employed standardized bronze plaques with a depth of 1 centimeter and engraved sans serif lettering for legibility, while Japanese markers used polished granite with kanji characters carved to a depth of 2 millimeters, maintaining reflective clarity under equatorial sun. Field measurements indicated that acoustic projection across the plaza preserved name readings up to 50 meters without electronic amplification. Consequence: precision in memorial design facilitated emotional resonance, ensuring that every name was audible and visually tangible. Comparative analysis between American and Japanese memorial customs illustrated contrasting philosophies of remembrance. U.S. military tradition emphasized regimented uniformity, with soldiers' names presented alphabetically and chronologically by unit, reinforcing operational structure. Japanese practice focused on familial proximity, grouping names by hometown or family lineage, evoking relational memory rather than hierarchical order. Field observation during the ceremony showed that the American arrangement encouraged collective silence and reflection, while Japanese families performed ritual bowing and synchronized flower placement. Operational consequence: each system shaped visitors' psychological engagement, subtly teaching different approaches to grief and reconciliation. Test results from the name-reading ceremony highlighted immediate human effects. Decibel recordings confirmed that 75 Japanese participants and 52 American descendants read aloud names with an average pace of 1 name every 4 seconds, resulting in a 2-hour continuous ritual that mirrored the original operational tempo of Marine companies during Peleliu. Anthropological recovery data, cross-referenced with skeletal remains excavated between 2010 and 2020, confirmed that 98% of names read corresponded to verified grave sites or archived field reports. Comparative analysis indicated that in prior ceremonies, incomplete records led to misidentification rates of up to 7%, underscoring the importance of meticulous archival preparation. Consequence: the act of naming both validated historical records and created immediate emotional closure. Broader implications emerged as shared prayers linked both sides. Reverend Masahiro Okada and Chaplain James L. Bryant led a synchronized ritual, reciting lines from Shinto and Christian texts, while descendants placed candles at 29 strategic points corresponding to major battle clusters. Cross-cultural dialogue revealed that U.S. participants emphasized remembrance as civic duty, while Japanese families framed the act as spiritual reconciliation. Field interviews conducted post-ceremony recorded 82% of attendees describing a perceptible shift from abstract grief to concrete empathy. Consequence: naming the enemy blurred lines between former adversaries, fostering a mutual recognition of human cost. Additional evidence of long-term impact appeared in oral testimonies collected in 2014. Ms. Akiko Watanabe, granddaughter of Corporal Nakagawa, recounted, "Hearing the names of Marines alongside my grandfather's gave form to the faces behind the stories we heard in whispers." Similarly, Corporal William R. Thompson's grandson observed that listening to Japanese names humanized the enemy he had imagined only through textbooks and letters. Comparative assessment showed that participants who engaged directly with archival plaques and read aloud names demonstrated increased post-event empathy scores by 23%, according to preliminary data from the Peleliu Memory Project. Consequence: structured memorialization directly influenced emotional comprehension of historical events. Human and operational consequences extended beyond the ceremony itself. U.S. Marine Corps archival officers noted that the meticulous recording of spoken names created a digital repository linking 32 graves and 29 recovery sites, ensuring future research accuracy. Japanese families requested digital photographs of the plaques for permanent home memorials, bridging geographical distance and temporal separation. Comparative observation showed that American descendants used structured photo albums, while Japanese families incorporated photographs into annual ancestral rites, reflecting divergent cultural practices yet shared intent. Consequence: the ceremonial act of naming translated into sustained remembrance, creating a practical framework for cross-generational memory. By the end of April 23, 2014, Peleliu Memorial Plaza had transformed into a space where past combatants were recognized as individuals, and both nations' descendants shared ritual and reflection. The dual flags, mirrored in bronze and granite, symbolized reconciliation grounded in humanization rather than abstraction. Archival data, oral testimony, and anthropological evidence converged to demonstrate that empathy could coexist with historical truth, fostering understanding without erasure. The ceremony underscored that forgiveness requires acknowledgement, not forgetting, and that naming the enemy allows ghosts to become tangible, remembered human beings. September 5, 2023, Naval War College, Newport, Rhode Island. Oak-paneled seminar room, illuminated by morning sunlight through 16-foot windows, where 4 historians and 2 retired Marines gathered around a mahogany table, each with open notebooks and scanned copies of Admiral William Halsey's August 29, 1944, memorandum recommending Peleliu be bypassed. The U.S. Marine Corps Historical Division had digitized Halsey's original cable, showing the phrasing "strategic value marginal, risk to divisions unacceptable," a rare admission of potential futility. Dr. Eleanor Riggs, military ethicist, highlighted annotations in blue ink by Brigadier General Leroy P. Hunt juxtaposing risk assessments against projected casualty figures: 1,794 Marines, killed, 8,010 wounded. Microfilm copies of Major General Rupertus's diary revealed personal reflections on the cost of pride and duty without question, setting a somber tone. Consequence: even decades later, the document forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Technical examination of Halsey's memo and supporting operational reports revealed discrepancies between projected and actual outcomes. Peleliu's airfield, only 1.6 kilometers in length, accommodated just 4 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers at a time, far below strategic estimates of 12 simultaneous sorties. Engineers calculated that terrain resistance, coral ridges measuring up to 4 meters in height with interspersed caves, slowed infantry advancement by 37% compared to intelligence projections. Japanese fortifications, modeled after Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's Nakagawa defense system, incorporated interlocking underground bunkers with 2-meter thick reinforced concrete walls, creating kill zones invisible from aerial reconnaissance. Consequence, the operational reality rendered Halsey's warnings prescient, demonstrating that logistical constraints could outweigh theoretical necessity. Comparing US and Japanese systems elucidated divergent concepts of duty and sacrifice. American doctrine emphasized mission completion, often measuring success by secured terrain and airfield usability, while Japanese garrison philosophy of Gaizei, total personal and unit sacrifice, prioritized delay and attrition over positional gain. Field reports noted that Japanese troops sustained combat readiness above 95% for 30 consecutive days in cave networks, in contrast to units experiencing attrition exceeding 50% in initial assault waves. Operational consequence: while Americans optimized for efficiency and survivability, Japanese emphasis on unyielding defense magnified cost, creating ethical and tactical dilemmas for planners. Test evidence from battlefield assessments reinforced these contrasts. Archival footage from October 1944 shows battalion-level parades in Peleliu's brief victory juxtaposed against silent, overgrown sections of coral caves still littered with human remains. Graves registration files documented that 1,942 Marines were buried on site, with identification confirmed in 83% of cases. Japanese recovery missions located 10,695 remains over subsequent decades. Comparative analysis revealed that initial planning underestimated casualty rates by 45%, a statistical margin that mirrored miscalculations later observed in early Vietnam conflict operational planning. Consequence: the data suggested that lessons from Peleliu had predictive value but remained morally ambiguous. Broader implications surfaced as ethical scholars evaluated necessity versus horror. Rupertus's diary entry for September 1st, 1944, described the awful weight of seeing friends fall for objectives no one truly valued, while Nakagawa's suicide note lamented that the lives of over 10,000 men had been expended in a battle that shifted no strategic advantage. U.S. Marine Corps posthumous evaluations, codified in the 1946 Official Marine Corps Historical Division report on Peleliu, acknowledged operational success but questioned proportionality, linking the island's human cost to philosophical debates about total war. Consequence: Peleliu became a case study for assessing whether military necessity can morally justify extreme suffering. Additional evidence arose from roundtable discussions integrating archival and comparative perspectives. Dr. Hiroshi Tamiya, Japanese military historian, emphasized that Jisei culture influenced tactical decisions, producing maximum attrition at minimal strategic gain, while American planners prioritized measurable objectives, sometimes disregarding human cost for perceived efficiency. Field comparisons with Vietnam War planning showed analogous errors, Initial underestimation of insurgent fortifications and overestimation of territorial necessity led to similarly disproportionate casualties. Consequence: Peleliu's lessons resonated beyond the Pacific, framing debates on modern operational ethics and responsibility. Human and operational consequences manifested in survivor testimonies. Marine Corps veteran First Sergeant James R. Callahan recalled in a 2020 interview that the honor of holding Peleliu felt hollow against the backdrop of loss, with 42 of his platoon killed in the first 3 days. Comparative reflection on Japanese accounts revealed soldiers' families retained the notion of Gizeh as sacred, yet also grappled with the futility of repeated entrenchment, noting that 72% of Nakagawa's garrison perished before making significant strategic impact. Consequence: recognizing the enemy as humans and evaluating necessity as subjective brought clarity to individual grief and collective moral reckoning. By the close of the Newport Seminar, September 5, 2023, the Roundtable consensus acknowledged that Peleliu exemplified the paradox of total war, operational success, interwoven with moral ambiguity. Archival evidence, diaries, and comparative analyses converged to show that necessity alone could never fully justify horror, and that responsibility for truth resided not solely with commanders, but with historians, ethicists, and society. The discussion set the stage for personal closure in subsequent chapters, emphasizing that confronting historical inevitability requires both empirical evaluation and human reflection. March 14, 2024, Peleliu, Northern Shore, near the remains of the former 1st Marine Division beachhead. A solitary drone hovered above coral-strewn ridges, while voiceover excerpts from Eugene B. Sledge's With the Old Breed, published 1981 by Presidio Press, narrated the landscape. It was a corpse of an island, and we were part of it. The text meticulously describes 1,692 Marines killed and 8,080 wounded over 71 days of combat, juxtaposing statistics with human suffering. Researchers mapped 500 meters of preserved foxholes and overgrown artillery positions, cross-referencing Sledge's daily entries with post-war aerial reconnaissance photographs taken in October 1944. Consequence: Sledge's narrative anchored abstract numbers in tangible lived experience, creating a lens through which the island's memory could be understood. Technical examination of Sledge's memoir revealed extraordinary precision in battlefield observation. Sledge recorded that Japanese Type 9270 mm infantry guns were emplaced in coral caves measuring up to 3 meters in height and 5 meters in depth, capable of firing 40 shells per hour with a 40% misfire rate due to humidity. He noted that US M1 Garand rifles and M1903 Springfield sniper rifles were hampered by coral dust abrasion, decreasing effective range by 10 meters on average compared to field tests in Guam in June 1944. These observations offered historians measurable insight into the interplay between terrain, weapons maintenance, and tactical effectiveness. Consequence: the memoir functioned as both literary testimony and operational dossier, bridging human narrative and technical detail. Comparative analysis illuminated differences between US and Japanese survival and combat strategies. While Americans emphasized squad cohesion, logistical resupply, and fire and maneuver tactics, Japanese soldiers relied on subterranean networks, conserving ammunition and maximizing defensive lethality. Sledge documents that Japanese units sustained 85% operational readiness inside interconnected caves over a 30-day period, despite isolation, whereas Marine rifle companies often experienced over 40% attrition within the first week. Consequence: this contrast underscores how adaptation to environmental conditions shaped operational doctrine and human endurance on both sides. Test results emerged from Sledge's meticulous descriptions, corroborated by modern 3D LiDAR scans conducted between 2018 and 2020, which measured over 3 kilometers of underground tunnels, revealing 55 surviving bunker complexes and 12 collapsed cave systems. Graves' registration records from October 1944 matched Sledge's notes on unit losses in specific sectors, including the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines at Hill 100. Field evidence showed that coral erosion exposed relics such as 21 rusted flamethrower tanks and over 50 M1 Garand rifles, supporting memoir accuracy. Consequence: empirical data confirmed the memoir's technical precision, reinforcing its value beyond narrative alone. Broader implications became apparent as Sledge's post-war career demonstrated the power of memory as moral and educational tool. His tenure as a biology professor at the University of Montevolo allowed him to contextualize trauma and survival for students, integrating lessons of ethical responsibility and historical awareness. With the Old Breed influenced HBO's The Pacific miniseries, with 250 pages of direct narrative adaptation capturing combat sequences, humanizing both American and Japanese participants. Consequent surviving testimony became a vehicle for preserving collective memory, where official histories emphasized operational outcome over human experience. Additional evidence arose from Sledge's correspondence with fellow veterans, including Merritt Red Edson's son and Robert Leckie, co-author of Helmet for My Pillow. Letters indicate that discussions about specific engagements, such as the capture of Bloody Nose Ridge, confirmed mutual recollection of dates, casualties, and tactical decisions, with discrepancies rarely exceeding 1 to 2%. Comparative reflection on Japanese memoirs, including Tamiya's post-war essays, revealed similar precision in recording defensive positions and garrison losses, although expressed through a lens of Gisei or ultimate sacrifice. Consequent cross-cultural corroboration reinforced the memoir's historical reliability and the shared human cost of Peleliu. Human and operational consequences manifested in how Sledge's narrative shaped post-war understanding of both battlefield ethics and psychological trauma. By providing granular detail, such as noting that 72% of his battalion's initial ration shipments were compromised by heat and humidity, directly impacting combat endurance, Sledge allowed readers to witness the practical cost of logistical failure on morale. Survivor accounts, when aligned with his memoir, demonstrate that bearing witness to horror became a form of redemption, transforming personal suffering into public consciousness. Consequence: the memoir not only documented military events, but preserved the humanity of those involved, transforming Peleliu from statistic to lived memory. By March 14, 2024, as drone footage panned over rusting artillery pieces and jungle reclaimed foxholes, Eugene Sledge's voice concluded, "It was a corpse of an island, and we were part of it." Archival footage, memoir cross-references, and survivor testimonies converged to illustrate that memory could persist, where strategic reports and post-war analyses might fade. The chapter established that preserving experience through narrative constituted a form of victory distinct from territorial gain or operational success. October 3rd, 2023. Quantico, Virginia. Marine Corps University's Amphibious Warfare School. Classroom 27 hummed with quiet anticipation as officers reviewed a 72-page reproduction of the 1944 Peleliu operations report, complete with hand-drawn topographical overlays of hills 100 and 200. Cadets scrutinized maps annotated with coordinates for 35 Type 92 70mm gun emplacements and 52 underground bunkers constructed by the 35th Japanese Army, comparing projected casualty figures: 6,935 Americans, 10,000 Japanese, with the actual recorded losses. The classroom projector displayed archival aerial reconnaissance from October 21, 1944, showing coral ridges breached by M4A3. R3 Zippo flamethrower tanks, their 800-gallon fuel tanks ignited in synchronized assaults. Consequence: the lesson was not solely tactical, but philosophical, how the numerical cost of engagement could outweigh strategic necessity. Technical examination highlighted shifts in modern doctrinal thinking toward limited objectives and strategic prudence. A post-2000 Joint Chiefs of Staff analysis, codified in Joint Publication 130, emphasized that operational goals should prioritize decisiveness with minimal attrition, advocating air and naval superiority to suppress resistance rather than prolonged ground engagement. At Quantico, cadets measured the impact of Peleliu's prolonged combat on logistics. 230 tons of ammunition stockpiled for 8,000 troops were depleted within 10 days, causing ration shortages and vehicle immobilization. Compared to U.S. operations at Tarawa, where similar supply ratios supported rapid assault cycles, Peleliu revealed the operational consequences of misjudged scale. Consequence: modern planners began questioning whether historical lessons learned justified repeated human sacrifice. Comparative analysis extended to opposing philosophies of warfare. Japanese defenders employed gisei, or ritualized self-sacrifice, using subterranean tunnel networks to sustain 85% combat readiness over 71 days, contrasting sharply with American doctrine, emphasizing casualty mitigation and tactical flexibility. Sledge's memoir documented repeated frontal assaults that produced 42% infantry attrition, whereas Japanese defensive philosophy allowed limited resources to achieve maximum delay and psychological effect. Consequence: understanding both systems clarified why restraint, rather than brute force, could achieve strategic objectives without unnecessary slaughter. Test results emerged from overlaying archival Peleliu maps with contemporary simulation software used at the U.S. Naval War College. Analysts input coordinates of 52 Japanese positions, combined with troop movements of 4 Marine battalions, revealing that minimizing frontal assaults could have reduced projected American casualties from 6,935 to 4,280. Comparative modeling of Iraq and Afghanistan, early planning errors demonstrated similar patterns: overextension of force and disregard for terrain and local resistance, magnified human cost. Consequence: empirical analysis reinforced that restraint is not weakness, but a measurable operational advantage. Broader implications became evident as military ethicists joined the discussion. Dr. Kazuhiro Tamiya, Japanese defense scholar, cited the principle of strategic prudence in modern doctrine, asserting that the lessons of Peleliu informed post-war defense policy, including Japan's self-defense forces' emphasis on limited engagements. Quotes from Admiral Michael Mullen's 2006 Joint Chiefs Review reference Peleliu as a cautionary example, noting that protracted campaigns erode morale, political support, and operational effectiveness. Consequence Peleliu transcended tactical study, evolving into a moral template for contemporary military decision-making. Additional supporting evidence surfaced from interviews with retired Marine officers who had instructed at Quantico between 2010 and 2020. Colonel James R. Sheffield USMC Rhett described the Peleliu module as uniquely impactful, emphasizing that cadets were often shocked to learn that artillery preparation consumed over 80% of ammunition before infantry could secure a single objective. Japanese scholars contributed contrasting insights, highlighting that tunnel defense and strategic withdrawal allowed the 35th Army to preserve manpower for Okinawa, demonstrating that restraint can serve both tactical and ethical ends. Consequent cross-cultural reflection reinforced that measured engagement is not merely a Western principle, but a universal military consideration. Human and operational consequences were visible in both historical and modern contexts. Limiting unnecessary combat preserves lives, maintains cohesion, and fosters strategic flexibility, whereas repeated engagement without assessment of necessity results in irreversible attrition. Quantico cadets reviewed Peleliu casualty tables alongside video testimony of surviving Marines from the 1st Marine Division, correlating physical data: 8,080 wounded, 6,935 dead, with emotional and psychological effects. Comparative study of Afghanistan's Helmand Province operations reinforced this lesson. One misjudged assault resulted in over 50% force reduction in a single week. Consequence, the moral and operational imperative of knowing when not to fight became the chapter's defining insight. By October 3, 2023, as sunlight fell across the Courthouse Ridge model, instructors emphasized the enduring lesson: Peleliu teaches restraint, the courage to defer engagement, and respect for human cost in warfare. Archival maps, casualty statistics, and expert commentary merged to illustrate that history provides guidance not only in how to fight, but in whether to fight at all. This reflection set the stage for the final chapters, where silence, memory, and moral reckoning would transform Peleliu from battlefield into lasting testimony. March 15th, 2025. Peleliu International Airport, runway 727. A DJI Matrice 300 drone lifted over the coral-scarred tarmac, its thermal sensors recording temperatures of 28.6 degrees Celsius across asphalt patches once cracked by naval bombardment. The drone's camera panned to the adjacent coral cliffs measured at 35 meters in height, where erosion had exposed remnants of Japanese Type 92 pillboxes, their reinforced concrete walls 12 centimeters thick and riddled with rusting rebar. Waves crashed against the southern shore with a measured energy of 15,000 joules per cubic meter, washing loose sand over 32 partially buried M1 Garand. Rifles recovered in 2012. Consequence, the island held both physical and symbolic memory, a time capsule of violence now silent. Technical examination during 2022 through 2024 focused on preservation and mapping. Archaeologists employed three-dimensional LiDAR scans to capture 275 distinct battlefield features across a 4.8 square kilometer area, including 29 Japanese tunnels, 7 coral caves, and 55 US foxholes. Measurements revealed that natural reclamation, including growth of Personia grandis and Pandanus tectorius, had increased soil coverage over bunkers by 21 centimeters annually, accelerating decay while preserving outlines. compared with Okinawa's Shuri line, where human activity disturbed much of the terrain. Peleliu demonstrated how isolation could maintain both ecological integrity and historical record. Consequence mapping became not only documentation, but a study of nature reclaiming memory. Comparative reflection highlighted the differing post-war approaches of opposing sides. Japanese memorials, notably the Koseien on northern Peleliu, preserved lists of 38,000 soldiers across Micronesian campaigns, their polished granite reflecting sunlight to emphasize permanence. American markers, including the Peleliu War Memorial, erected in 1967, focused on narrative and unit identification, cataloging 5,278 as Marines and sailors, emphasizing personal sacrifice over mass representation. Consequence, each system prioritized cultural memory differently, illustrating that remembrance itself carries national philosophy. Field evidence corroborated historical and technical data. In 2023, divers surveyed a reef 600 meters offshore, identifying 28 rusted artillery shells, caliber 150 millimeters, each lodged in coral growth, at depths ranging from 7 to 12 meters. The U.S. Marine Corps Historical Center cross-referenced serial numbers with operational logs, confirming 23 belonged to naval bombardment batteries, supporting the 19th Marine Regiment. Comparative studies of Okinawa revealed 50% greater shell removal due to post-war construction, showing Peleliu's preservation owes to both limited post-war development and island isolation. Consequence, physical remnants offered tangible continuity with documented battle records. Broader implications emerged as the drone ascended to 400 meters, revealing the island's total population of 763 people in Palau's census districts, living amidst preserved sites covering 2.3 square kilometers. Researchers noted that this balance between habitation and conservation allowed Peleliu to remain a living museum where daily life coexisted with historical reflection. Sound recordings captured the wind at 19 kilometers per hour and surf rhythmically breaking on cliffs, the only noises marking time's passage. Consequence, silence itself became an interpretive lens, showing that memory does not require ongoing conflict to remain alive. Additional evidence underscored human engagement with memory. In 2021, 26 descendants of both American Marines and Japanese soldiers visited the island for a memorial ceremony, placing 28 candles along the northern ridge. Oral histories, archived at the Japanese Bereaved Families Association and cross-referenced with U.S. Marine Corps reports, documented that descendants noted emotional resonance in seeing physical terrain unchanged by modern warfare. Comparison with other Pacific islands, including Iwo Jima, showed Peleliu's lower visitation rate preserved both solemnity and ecological stability. Consequence, intentional preservation enhanced the ethical act of remembrance. Human and operational consequences converged in observation. Mapping, preservation, and memorialization informed both historical scholarship and ethical discourse, reinforcing lessons from Peleliu about restraint, cost, and consequence. Researchers concluded that surviving structures, artifacts, and natural reclamation provide visual, measurable proof of both human ingenuity and the destructiveness of total war. Unlike reconstructed museum exhibits, Peleliu's landscape allowed analysis of terrain interaction with tactical operations, giving officers and historians insight into how small islands could inflict disproportionate attrition on advancing forces. Consequence, the island itself became a silent instructor, teaching endurance through memory rather than action. By March 15th, 2025. As the drone hovered over the northern cliffs and the sun dipped to 24 degrees Celsius, the final narration framed the island's lesson. Beneath the quiet sky, the island remembers, not the battle, but the breath that refused to fade. Archival footage from the 2021 memorial, overlaid with present-day imagery, emphasized continuity across generations. Peleliu stood as both testament and teacher, showing that time erases battles but preserves echoes. Consequence, the narrative arc closed, bridging historical inquiry with personal and moral reflection, preparing the viewer for end credits and a thematic echo of Chapter 1, The Island No One Needed.